Hello, and welcome to NightSleep Whisper. Tonight, it's time to leave the outside world behind and retreat into the quietest corners of your mind. I am taking you far away, to a stormy coast and an ancient villa filled with secrets. In this 50-chapter journey, as we uncover the mysteries of the deep ocean, you will feel time itself begin to slow down. Now, adjust your pillow, gently close your eyes, and follow my voice. You are safe until the dawn. Our story begins. Mr. Reed sat in his quiet office. He was a very talented architect. He designed many modern buildings in the city. But lately, business was slow. He looked at his wooden desk and sighed. Then, the mail arrived. There was a large, thick envelope among the bills. Mr. Reed opened it and found a photograph. The photo showed a massive house. It stood on a high, jagged cliff. Below the cliff, the dark blue sea crashed against the rocks. The house had grey stone walls and many tall chimneys. It looked very strong but very lonely. A small note under the photo said, "The Black Villa." Mr. Reed read the letter inside the envelope. It was from a lawyer named Mr. Grant. The letter was formal and serious. It said that the owner of the Black Villa was gone. The house was now empty and falling apart. Mr. Grant needed an expert to fix the old building. He wanted Mr. Reed to make the house look new again. The Black Villa. Mr. Reed whispered to himself. He heard stories about that place before. People said it was built more than 100 years ago. It was famous for its size and its mystery. He looked at a map on the wall. The villa was far away from the city. It was in a remote area on the cold coast. Mr. Reed decided to take the job. He needed a challenge and he needed the money. He picked up his telephone and dialed the number in the letter. A man with a deep, calm voice answered almost immediately. "Hello. This is Mr. Grant speaking." "Hello, Mr. Grant. This is Mr. Reed. I am the architect. I received your letter and the photo of the villa. I am very happy to hear from you." Mr. Grant said, "The Black Villa is a special place. It needs a person with your great skills. However, the work is private. You must not talk to the newspapers or other people about this project. It is a secret." Mr. Reed was curious. Why is it a secret? The family history is very complicated. Mr. Grant replied, "We want to avoid any trouble from the public. Can you come this Monday?" Mr. Reed thought for a moment. "Yes. I can be there by noon." "Excellent. I will meet you at the main gate. I will give you the keys and show you the rooms. You will live in the villa while you work. There is plenty of food and a comfortable bed for you." Mr. Reed said goodbye and ended the call. He felt a mix of excitement and a little bit of worry. He spent the rest of the weekend preparing for the trip. He packed his architectural tools, his heavy boots, and his large drawing paper. He wondered what he would find inside those grey stone walls. He put his suitcase in his car and looked at the photo one last time. The house looked like a dark giant waiting for him. He started his engine and began the long drive toward the sea. Mr. Reed drove his car away from the busy city. At first, there were many tall buildings and bright lights. He saw people walking to work and many other cars on the road. But after 3 hours, the buildings disappeared. The road became quiet. He saw green fields and small farms. Then, the trees became taller and darker. The sky changed too. In the city, the sun was bright. Now, the clouds were grey and heavy. Mr. Reed turned on his headlights. The road was very narrow now. It moved up and down through the hills. He felt the car move left and right on the sharp turns. He held the steering wheel tightly with both hands. Soon, he smelled something different. It was a salty smell. He knew the ocean was near. He looked out the side window. Far below, he saw the water. The sea was not blue today. It was a dark, angry grey. White foam hit the black rocks. The wind was very strong. It pushed against his car. The tall trees near the road bent in the wind. Mr. Reed looked at his map. He was very close to the black villa. There were no other houses here. There were no shops or gas stations. He felt very small in this big, wild place. He wondered who lived in such a lonely house. Why did they build it so far away from everyone? Suddenly, the road turned one last time. Mr. Reed stopped his car. He looked up. There it was. The black villa sat on the very edge of a high cliff. It was much bigger than the photograph. The stone walls were dark from the rain of many years. The windows looked like many black eyes watching the road. The house had a large iron gate at the front. The metal was old and orange with rust. Behind the gate, a long path led to the front door. The grass in the garden was very long and yellow. It looked like nobody cared for this place for a long time. Mr. Reed checked his watch. It was exactly noon. He was on time. He looked for Mr. Grant's car, but he did not see it. He saw only his own car and the big, silent house. He felt a cold chill on his neck. He took a deep breath. "I am here to work," he said to himself. He opened the car door. The cold wind hit his face immediately. It was a very sharp, biting cold. He put on his heavy coat and walked toward the iron gate. He waited for the lawyer to arrive. The only movement was the grass waving in the wind and the dark birds flying over the chimneys. The black villa was waiting for him. Mr. Reed stood by the rusty gate for 5 minutes. The wind was very strong and cold. He pulled his collar up to protect his neck. Suddenly, he saw a black car coming up the road. The car was slow and very quiet. It stopped near Mr. Reed's car. A tall man stepped out of the black car. He wore a long, dark coat and a black hat. His face was thin and very pale. He did not smile. This was Mr. Grant, the lawyer. He walked toward Mr. Reed with slow, careful steps. "Good afternoon, Mr. Reed," the lawyer said. His voice was deep and very dry. "You are on time. I like people who are on time." "Good afternoon, Mr. Grant," Mr. Reed replied. He tried to be friendly, but the lawyer stayed very formal. "The house is very impressive. It is much larger than I thought." Mr. Grant looked up at the grey stone walls of the villa. "It is a house of many secrets, Mr. Reed. It was built by a man who loved the sea and his privacy. Now, it is your job to make it safe again. The roof is leaking, and many walls are weak." The lawyer reached into his deep coat pocket. He pulled out a very large object. It was a heavy iron key. The key was almost as long as a man's hand. It was dark and cold. Mr. Grant held it for a moment before he gave it to Mr. Reed. "This is the key to the main door," Mr. Grant said. "It is the only one. Do not lose it. The locks in this house are very old and very difficult to change." Mr. Reed took the key. It was very heavy in his hand. He felt the cold metal against his skin. "I will be very careful with it," he promised. Mr. Grant nodded slowly. "Good. You have everything you need inside. There is a kitchen with food. There is a bedroom with clean sheets. I will visit you in 1 week to see your progress. Until then, you will be alone here." "Alone?" Mr. Reed asked. "Is there no caretaker? No one to help with the heavy work?" "No," Mr. Grant said firmly. "The owners want no strangers in the house. You are the only person with permission to be inside. If you see anyone else near the cliff, you must call me immediately." The lawyer walked to the gate. He pushed it with his gloved hand. The metal made a long, high noise as it moved. It was a very unpleasant sound in the quiet afternoon. Mr. Grant pointed to the long, yellow grass. "Go inside now, Mr. Reed. The sun will set soon. This is not a good place to be in the dark." Mr. Grant did not say goodbye. He got back into his black car and drove away. Mr. Reed watched the car disappear behind the hills. Now, it was just him, the heavy iron key, and the black villa. He looked at the large key in his hand and then at the dark front door. He began to walk up the path. Mr. Reed walked to the large front door. It was made of dark, heavy wood. He held the heavy iron key in his hand. He put the key into the lock. It was difficult to turn at first because the lock was very old. He had to use both hands and pull hard. Finally, the lock made a loud, heavy clicking sound. He pushed the door with his shoulder. The wood made a deep, low noise as it moved slowly across the floor. Inside, the air was very still and cold. It smelled like old paper and thick dust. Mr. Reed stepped into a very large hallway. The ceiling was very high, and the walls were made of grey stone. Above him, a big glass lamp hung from a gold chain. It was covered in grey spider webs. He found a small metal switch on the wall and flipped it. The light was very dim and yellow, but now he could see the room better. The hallway was full of strange shapes. At first, Mr. Reed felt a little bit nervous. But then he realized the shapes were only furniture. Every chair, table, and sofa was covered with a large white sheet. In the dim light, the sheets looked like silent ghosts standing in the room. He walked slowly past them. His heavy boots made a soft, hollow sound on the wooden floor. Every small sound felt very loud in the quiet house. He saw a grand staircase at the end of the hall. The stairs were made of dark wood and had a thick red carpet. The carpet was very dusty and old. Near the stairs, there was a tall clock. It was taller than Mr. Reed. He looked at the white face of the clock, but the hands did not move. It was stopped at exactly 3 o'clock. "Is anyone here?" Mr. Reed asked. His voice moved through the empty house and came back to him. There was no answer. He walked into the dining room. There was a long table with 12 chairs. All of them were covered in white sheets too. On the walls, there were many large paintings. The paintings were also covered with thin, white cloth. He could not see the faces of the people in the pictures. It felt as if the house was hiding its history from him. He felt a bit cold, so he went to find the kitchen. Mr. Grant said there was food there. He found a small door behind the stairs. The kitchen was very big and very old. It had a large iron stove and many heavy metal pots. He opened a wooden cupboard. Inside, he found cans of soup, some bread, and a box of tea. He felt a little better. He was not going to be hungry tonight. Next to the kitchen, he found a small bedroom. This was the guest room. There was a bed, a small desk, and a simple lamp. The sheets on the bed were clean and white. There was a small window that looked out at the sea. He could hear the waves hitting the cliff far below. It was a very lonely and sad sound. Mr. Reed put his suitcase on the bed. He was very tired from the long drive. He decided to rest for a few minutes. He sat on the bed and looked at the dusty hallway through the open door. The black villa was very quiet, but he felt like the house was watching him. The sun went down quickly. Mr. Reed watched the last orange light disappear behind the dark sea. The sky turned a deep, bruised purple and then total black. He made a hot cup of tea in the old kitchen. The kitchen felt very large and cold at night. He sat at the small wooden table and listened to the house. The wind was very loud now. It pushed against the stone walls and made the heavy windows shake in their frames. He felt very isolated. There were no streetlights here. There were no neighbors to call for help. He finished his tea and walked back to the guest room. On his way, he passed the dining room. In the dark, the white sheets on the chairs looked even more like people standing in the shadows. He walked faster. When he reached his room, he checked the door. It was locked. He felt a little bit safer behind the wood. He turned off the small lamp and climbed into the bed. The room was very dark. He could only see the pale curtains moving slowly in the air. For a long time, he just listened to the waves hitting the rocks far below. The sound of the sea was like a heavy, constant rhythm. He finally started to fall asleep. Suddenly, he woke up. He did not know why, but he felt a cold chill. He stayed very still and looked up at the dark ceiling. Then, he heard it. Above his head, on the second floor, there was a clear sound. It was the sound of a heavy shoe hitting the wooden floor. It was a slow and steady walk. Someone was moving in the room directly above him. Mr. Reed's heart began to beat very fast in his chest. He remembered the words of Mr. Grant very clearly. "You are the only person with permission to be inside." But the footsteps did not stop. They moved slowly across the floor. He heard the old wood groan and creak under the weight of the unknown person. The person walked to the door of the room and then moved into the upper hallway. Mr. Reed sat up in bed. He did not turn on the light because he did not want to show his location. He reached out his hand and found the heavy iron key on the small table. He held the cold metal tightly. The footsteps were now in the hallway. They were moving toward the top of the grand staircase. He waited and listened. He expected to hear the sound of someone coming down the stairs, but the footsteps suddenly stopped. The house became completely silent once again. Only the wind and the sea remained. Mr. Reed did not go back to sleep. He stayed awake for the rest of the night. He watched the bedroom door and waited for the first light of the morning sun. Who was walking in the empty house? How did they get inside? He had the only key. The sun rose over the ocean. The light was pale and cold. Mr. Reed stood up and stretched his tired arms. He did not sleep much. His eyes were heavy, but his mind was busy. He thought about the heavy footsteps from the night. He had to know the truth. He opened his door and walked into the quiet hallway. The house was very still now. He walked up the grand staircase. Every step made a soft noise on the wood, but it was not the heavy step he heard last night. He reached the second floor. The air here was even colder than downstairs. He saw a long row of dark doors. He went to the room that was directly above his own bedroom. The door was slightly open. Mr. Reed pushed it. It moved slowly and quietly. This was a very elegant bedroom. There was a large bed with 4 tall posts and a mirror with a gold frame. The mirror was very old. The glass was dark and dirty. Mr. Reed saw his own face in the mirror. He looked pale and worried. He looked at the floor. The dust was very thick here. He looked for footprints. He expected to see marks from the heavy shoes he heard during the night. But the dust was perfect. There were no marks at all. It looked like nobody walked in this room for 20 years. Mr. Reed felt a cold shiver. How was this possible? He knew what he heard. He moved to a small table near the bed. There was a small photograph in a silver frame. He picked it up and wiped the dust away with his sleeve. The photo was of a woman. She was very beautiful and looked quite young. She had a kind face and dark, intelligent eyes. She wore a long, white pearl necklace. The pearls in the photo were big and very bright. But when Mr. Reed looked closer, he saw something strange. Someone took a sharp object, like a knife or a needle, and scratched the photo. The marks were only on the pearls. The person pushed very hard. The paper was torn where the pearls used to be. The rest of the photo was perfect. The woman's face was not touched. Only the necklace was destroyed. Mr. Reed felt very uncomfortable. This was not the work of time or accidents. This was the work of a person. A person with a lot of anger. He put the photo back on the table. He looked at the dark corners of the room. He felt like he was being watched by the house itself. He decided to leave the room. He needed to start his work on the walls. But the image of the scratched necklace stayed in his head. Who was this woman? And who hated her pearls so much that they attacked her picture? Mr. Reed went back downstairs. He carried his architectural notebook and a long measuring tape. He needed to focus on his job. He decided to examine the walls on the ground floor first. He walked past the grand staircase and reached a part of the house he did not see yesterday. At the very end of the long hallway, there was a magnificent door. This door was different from the others. It was made of a very dark wood, perhaps oak, and it had beautiful carvings of sea monsters and waves. Above the door, a small sign made of brass said, "Library." Mr. Reed loved books. He thought the library would be a good place to find old maps or plans of the villa. He reached for the round metal handle. He turned it to the right, but it did not move. He turned it to the left, but it was stuck. The library was locked. He took out the heavy iron key that Mr. Grant gave him. He tried to put it into the lock, but the key was too large. This lock was smaller and more modern than the one on the front door. Mr. Reed stood in front of the door for a moment. He felt disappointed. Just as he turned to walk away, he stopped. He heard a very clear sound coming from inside the library. It was the sound of wood sliding against wood. It sounded exactly like a heavy chair being pushed across a floor. "Is someone in there?" Mr. Reed asked loudly. He waited for an answer. The house was silent for a few seconds. Then, he heard a second sound. It was a soft thud, like a book falling onto a rug. Mr. Reed felt a wave of heat go up his neck. He was not alone. Someone was definitely inside the library. He knocked on the door with his fist. "Mr. Grant. Is that you?" There was no reply. He put his ear against the cold wood of the door. He listened very carefully. He did not hear any more movement, but he heard something else. It was the sound of slow, steady breathing. It was very faint, but it was there. Someone was standing on the other side of the door, listening to him too. Mr. Reed felt a sudden fear. He was a strong man, but this situation was very strange. He was supposed to be the only person with a key. He ran to the front door and checked it. It was still locked from the inside. He checked the windows in the dining room. They were all closed and locked. He went back to the library door. He pushed it with his shoulder, but the wood was too thick and the lock was too strong. He could not get inside. He decided to go outside and look at the library from the garden. Maybe he could see through the windows. He grabbed his coat and hurried to the front door. He needed to see who was hiding in the heart of the black villa. Mr. Reed stepped out into the cold air. The wind was very loud and the sea was angry. He walked along the stone wall of the villa. He found the windows of the library. They were high above his head. He found an old wooden crate and stood on it. He pressed his face against the glass. He could see nothing. The curtains inside were thick and black. He felt a sense of failure. He was the architect, but the house was winning. He went back inside and tried to work. He measured the walls in the hallway. He wrote numbers in his notebook, but his hand was shaking a little. He kept looking at the library door. It remained silent and closed. He felt like a guest in a house that did not want him. He wondered if Mr. Grant was telling him the whole truth. The evening was long. He ate some soup and drank more tea. He did not go to the second floor. He stayed in the kitchen where it was warm. Finally, he went to his bedroom. He turned off the lamp and sat in the dark. He watched the window. The ocean was a vast, dark space. The sound of the waves hitting the rocks was constant and heavy. It was exactly midnight when the light appeared. It was a small, sharp beam. It cut through the darkness on the cliff. Mr. Reed froze. He watched the light move. It was a person with a flashlight. The person stood on the very edge of the jagged rocks. The wind was blowing their coat, but they stood very still. The person moved the flashlight in a circle. Then, they pointed it down at the waves. They seemed to be looking for something in the water. After a few minutes, the person turned the light toward the villa. The bright beam hit the stone walls. It moved from window to window. Suddenly, the light hit Mr. Reed's window. He jumped back into the corner of the room. He hoped the person did not see him. The light stayed on his window for 3 seconds. Then, it moved away. The person turned off the flashlight. The cliff was dark again. Mr. Reed could not see the person anymore. He stayed by the wall for a long time. He felt very alone. The nearest town was miles away. His phone had no signal in this remote area. He realized he was in a difficult situation. Someone was outside, and someone might be inside. The Black Villa was not just a project. It was a mystery. He looked at the heavy iron key on the table. He did not feel like the master of the house. He felt like a prisoner. He decided that tomorrow, he would not just measure walls. He would look for answers. The sun was finally up. Mr. Reed did not feel rested. He stayed awake for hours after the light on the cliff disappeared. He looked out his bedroom window one more time. The cliff was empty now. The person with the flashlight was gone. He washed his face with cold water. The water was very cold, but it helped him feel more awake. He put on his heavy boots and walked out of the bedroom. He entered the main hallway. He stopped suddenly. There was a large mirror on the wall between the dining room and the stairs. Yesterday, it was a beautiful mirror with a gold frame. Today, it was destroyed. The glass was in many small, sharp pieces on the floor. The pieces looked like bright diamonds in the morning light. Mr. Reed walked closer. He was very careful. He did not want to step on the glass with his boots. He looked at the wall. The gold frame was still there, but it was empty. The mirror was not just cracked. It was hit with something very heavy and hard. He looked at the floor, but he did not see a rock or a tool. There was nothing near the glass except for the thick dust. He examined the gold frame. In the top corner, he saw something white. It was a small piece of paper. It was stuck between the wood and a small piece of broken glass. He pulled it out slowly. His fingers were shaking a little bit. The paper was old and a little bit yellow. It had a few words written in dark, black ink. "The sea takes everything." The note said. The handwriting was very elegant, but the message was very scary. Mr. Reed looked around the hallway. The house was quiet, but he did not feel alone anymore. He felt like the person who broke the mirror was still very near. He thought about the person on the cliff from last night. Was it the same person? Or was someone else living in the secret corners of the villa? He looked at the grand stairs. He remembered the heavy footsteps from the night before. He looked at the locked library door. The house had too many questions and no answers. He decided to call Mr. Grant. He needed to tell the lawyer about the broken mirror and the strange note. He went to the kitchen to find the lawyer's phone number. But when he reached the kitchen, he saw something new. The back door was slightly open. The wind was blowing it back and forth. Mr. Reed felt a cold breeze on his face. He was sure he locked that door last night. He walked to the door and looked outside. The long grass was wet from the rain. He saw a line of footprints in the dark mud. They led away from the house and toward the edge of the cliff. He knew he had to be careful, but he also knew he had to see where those footprints went. Mr. Reed followed the footprints for a few meters. The mud was very soft. The marks were deep and fresh. But suddenly, he heard a new noise. It was the sound of a car engine. The sound was coming from the front of the house. He stopped and looked back. He did not want to leave the footprints, but he needed to see who was arriving. He ran back to the front of the villa. A small, red car was parked near the iron gate. It was a very bright color compared to the grey stone of the house. A woman stepped out of the car. She looked to be about 30 years old. She had long, blonde hair and wore a warm brown coat. She looked at the high walls of the villa with a sad expression on her face. Mr. Reed walked toward her. "Hello," he called out. The woman jumped a little. She looked surprised to see him. "Oh. Hello. I did not know anyone was living here. I am Mr. Reed," he explained. "I am an architect. Mr. Grant hired me to fix the house. Who are you?" The woman walked closer and offered her hand. "My name is Elena. I am the niece of the old owner. I grew up visiting this house during the summers." Mr. Reed felt a wave of confusion. He remembered his conversation with Mr. Grant very clearly. The lawyer said the owners wanted no strangers. He also said there were no family members to help. "The niece?" Mr. Reed asked. "Mr. Grant told me there were no family members left. He said the house belonged to the estate now." Elena's face changed. Her kind eyes became narrow and serious. "Mr. Grant said that. That is very strange. My uncle loved this house. He told me that I would help decide its future. I have been trying to call Mr. Grant for weeks, but he does not answer my calls." Mr. Reed looked at the red car and then back at the dark villa. He did not know who to believe. Mr. Grant was a professional lawyer, but he was also very cold and secretive. Elena seemed nice, but she was a stranger too. "I found a note this morning," Mr. Reed said. He decided to test her. "And a broken mirror. Do you know anything about that?" Elena looked shocked. "A broken mirror? Which one?" "The large one in the hallway," Reed replied. Elena shook her head slowly. Her face was pale. "That mirror was my aunt's favorite. She said it was a gift from the sea. This is not good. Mr. Reed, if someone is breaking things in this house, they are looking for something. We are not safe here." Mr. Reed looked at the front door. He thought about the footprints in the mud and the footsteps in the night. Now there was a second guest who was not supposed to exist. The mystery was growing larger every hour. "Come inside," Mr. Reed said. "It is too cold to stand out here. We need to talk about Mr. Grant." Mr. Reed led Elena into the kitchen. He felt that the kitchen was the only room in the villa that felt normal. He moved the heavy iron kettle onto the stove and lit a small fire. Soon, the water was hot. He made 2 cups of tea. The steam rose into the cold air of the room. Elena sat at the wooden table. She wrapped her hands around the warm cup. She looked very tired. Mr. Reed sat across from her. He looked at her eyes. She seemed honest, but he was still very careful. "Tell me about your uncle, Elena," Mr. Reed said. "And tell me why you are here today." Elena took a slow sip of her tea. "My uncle was Captain Thomas. He spent 40 years at sea. He was a brave and strong man. He bought this villa because he loved the sound of the ocean. He died 3 months ago. In his will, he said I was the only person he trusted with this house." Mr. Reed frowned. "That is not what Mr. Grant told me. He told me that your uncle was a banker from the city. He said your uncle had no children and no family. He said the house belongs to a large company now." Elena shook her head quickly. "That is a lie. My uncle was never a banker. He hated the city. And Mr. Grant. He was not my uncle's lawyer. My uncle used a man named Mr. Miller from the village. I do not know this Mr. Grant." I only saw his name on the letters he sent to the house after the funeral. Mr. Reed felt a cold feeling in his stomach. If Mr. Grant was lying about the owner, what else was he lying about? Why did he hire an architect if he did not own the house? The lawyer gives me keys, Mr. Reed said. He pays me from a big bank account. He seems to have a lot of power here. He is dangerous, Mr. Reed. Elena whispered. She leaned closer across the table. I think he is looking for something. My uncle had a collection of very rare items from his travels. The most famous was a pearl necklace. People said it was worth a fortune. After he died, the necklace disappeared. Mr. Reed remembered the photograph from the upstairs bedroom. He remembered the pearls that were scratched out of the picture with a knife. I saw a photo, Mr. Reed said. A woman with pearls. But the pearls were destroyed in the picture. Elena gasped. She put her cup down on the table. That was my aunt's photo. She died many years ago. If someone is attacking her picture, they are very angry or very desperate. We must find the truth before Mr. Grant returns. Mr. Reed looked at the kitchen door. He thought about the heavy footsteps and the person on the cliff. He realized that he was in the middle of a battle between a niece and a lawyer. He did not know who was the thief, but he knew the Black Villa was holding a dark secret. Mr. Reed decided to start his work. He wanted to feel like a real architect again. He went to the hallway with his heavy tool bag. He looked at the wooden walls. Some of the wood was old and soft from the wet air. He found a place near the stairs where the wood was very dark. It looked like water was behind the wall. He took a small hammer and a flat metal tool. He pushed the tool into a small gap between the wooden boards. He moved his arm slowly. The wood was very old. He pulled a large piece of wood away from the wall. Behind the wood, it was very dark. He did not see water. Instead, he saw something white. He reached his hand into the dark hole. He touched something dry and thin. It felt like old paper. He pulled it out carefully. It was a long, rolled piece of paper. It was covered in thick, gray dust. What did you find? Elena asked. She was standing behind him. She looked very curious. Mr. Reed put the paper on the floor. He opened it slowly. The paper was very old and yellow. It was a map. He saw the name of the house at the top. Silver Sands Villa. That was the old name. Elena whispered. Before people called it the Black Villa. The map showed all the rooms of the house. It showed the kitchen, the library, and the bedrooms. But there were other lines on the map too. These lines were not for rooms. They started in the basement and moved deep under the ground. They led all the way to the cliff and the sea. These are tunnels, Mr. Reed said. He pointed his finger at the dark lines. There is a secret way to leave the house without using the front door. Elena looked at the map with wide eyes. My uncle never told me about tunnels. He said the basement was only for old boxes. Mr. Reed looked at the drawing of the cliff. One tunnel ended at a small cave near the water. This explained a lot of things. It explained how someone could enter the house when the doors were locked. It explained the footprints in the mud that led to the cliff. It also explained why the person with the flashlight was standing on the rocks last night. The person I saw last night, Mr. Reed said. They were not just looking at the sea. They were looking for the entrance to these tunnels. Suddenly, they heard a noise. It was a deep, low noise. It was the sound of a heavy door closing somewhere deep below them. The sound moved through the floor and up into the hallway. Mr. Reed and Elena looked at each other. The house felt very cold again. The basement, Elena said. Her voice was shaking. Mr. Reed rolled up the map and put it in his pocket. He picked up his flashlight. "Stay behind me," he said. He began to walk toward the small door that led to the basement. The mystery of the Black Villa was no longer in the walls. It was under the ground. Mr. Reed and Elena did not go to the basement immediately. The noise they heard was deep and heavy, but it felt very close to the kitchen. They turned around and ran back down the hallway. Mr. Reed held his flashlight tightly. When they reached the kitchen door, they stopped. The room was silent. Mr. Reed pushed the door open. The kitchen looked normal at first. The chairs were in the same place. The old metal pots were still hanging on the wall. But the air in the room felt different. It was not cold anymore. It was very warm. He walked to the large iron stove. A few minutes ago, the fire was small. Now, the fire was bright and orange. It was burning very strongly. A large pot of water sat on the stove. The water was starting to boil. "I did not put that pot there," Mr. Reed said. His voice was low and serious. Elena pointed to the wooden table. "And look at that." On the table, there were the 2 cups of tea from their earlier conversation. But now, there was a third cup. It was a dark blue cup with a gold rim. It did not belong to the villa's kitchen set. Mr. Reed walked to the table and touched the side of the blue cup. It was very hot. A thin cloud of steam rose from the dark liquid inside. Someone was in this room only a few seconds ago. They made a fresh cup of tea and left it on the table. "Is it Mr. Grant?" Elena asked. She stayed near the door. She looked ready to run. "I don't think so," Mr. Reed replied. "Mr. Grant is a man of rules. He would not hide in the shadows and make tea. This is someone else. Someone who knows this house very well." Mr. Reed looked at the back door. It was closed and locked from the inside. He looked at the windows. They were also closed. There was no way for a person to leave the room quickly without using the main door where he and Elena were standing. He looked at the floor. The kitchen floor was made of large, flat stones. Near the heavy iron stove, he saw a small wet patch. It looked like a drop of water. Then he saw another one near the pantry door. The pantry was a small, dark room where they kept the food. Mr. Reed walked to the pantry door. He reached for the handle. His heart was beating fast. He pulled the door open quickly and moved his flashlight inside. The pantry was full of cans and boxes. But there was no person. However, he noticed something strange on the floor. There was a small wooden trapdoor. It was hidden under an empty flour sack. "The tunnels," Mr. Reed whispered. The map showed a path from the kitchen to the basement. "They are using the house like a maze." He realized the intruder was watching them. The warm tea was a message. It meant the person was not afraid of them. Mr. Reed felt a cold shiver. They were being hunted in a house of stone and shadows. Mr. Reed and Elena left the kitchen quickly. They did not want to stay in a room where someone was hiding under the floor. They walked back to the grand hallway. The dim light from the ceiling lamp made long, thin shadows on the grey stone walls. Mr. Reed looked at the many paintings. Every single one was still covered with a thick white sheet. He felt that the house was keeping its past hidden behind those cloths. "We need to see who lived here," Mr. Reed said. "Maybe the faces in these pictures can tell us something." He walked to the largest painting in the hall. It was a very tall frame made of heavy, dark wood. He reached up and grabbed the corner of the white sheet. He pulled it down with a strong movement. The heavy cloth fell to the floor silently. Behind the sheet was a beautiful oil painting. It showed a man standing on the deck of a large ship. He wore a dark blue captain's uniform with bright gold buttons. His hands were resting on a wooden railing. Behind him, the sea was calm and blue. It was a very professional and expensive portrait. But when Mr. Reed looked at the top of the painting, he stopped. He felt a cold wave of fear. The man in the painting had no face. Someone had used a very sharp knife to cut the canvas. They did not tear it. They cut a perfect circle where the man's face used to be. Behind the hole, there was only the dark, cold stone of the wall. It looked like the man was a ghost with an empty head. "This is my Uncle Thomas," Elena whispered. Her voice was very small and full of sadness. But why did they do this? Why take his face? Mr. Reed touched the edge of the cut canvas. The paint was dry, but the edges were very clean. This was not an accident, Elena. Someone wanted to erase him. First the pearls in the photograph, and now the face in the painting. This person is trying to destroy the identity of your family. Elena looked at the other covered paintings in the hall. Are they all like this? Mr. Reed went to the next painting and pulled the sheet away. It was a portrait of a woman in a green dress. Her face was also gone. He moved to the third painting. It showed a young man sitting in a library. Again, there was only a dark hole where the face belonged. Every portrait in the hallway was ruined in the exact same way. The hallway felt much colder now. Mr. Reed realized that the intruder was not just a thief. A thief takes gold or jewels. This person was taking memories. They were taking the history of the house. He looked at the empty holes in the paintings. It felt like many invisible eyes were watching them from the dark stone walls. He knew they had to find the silver key Elena mentioned earlier. They needed to find what was hidden in the cellar before the faceless man in the house found them. Elena and Mr. Reed walked away from the scary, faceless paintings. They went back to the small guest room. Elena sat on the edge of the bed. She looked at her brown coat. She reached into a small side pocket and pulled out a shining object. "I found this yesterday," she said. She held her hand out. "I did not think it was important then, but now I am not so sure." In her hand was a small silver key. It was very different from the heavy iron key of the front door. This key was thin and elegant. It had a beautiful design of a rose on the handle. It was very clean and did not have any rust. It looked like it belonged to a jewelry box or a small, private chest. "Where did you find it?" Mr. Reed asked. He took the key and held it near the lamp. The silver metal reflected the yellow light across the room. "I was walking in the garden before I met you," Elena explained. The wind was very strong near the cliff. It blew some dirt away from an old rose bush. I saw something bright in the dark mud. I used my hands to dig it out. It was this key. Mr. Reed examined the key carefully. "This is not a door key for the main house," he said. In old houses, the family often kept their most valuable treasures in a small silver box or a special cabinet. This key is for something secret. They looked at the map they found earlier. The map showed a small, square room in the basement. It was located in a corner, far away from the main stairs. It had no name on the map. It was just a small, empty space near the start of the secret tunnel. Mr. Grant told me the cellar was only for old boxes and coal. Mr. Reed remembered. But if this key was buried in the garden, someone wanted to hide it. Or maybe your uncle lost it a long time ago and could never open his secret box again. Elena looked at the dark hallway outside the room. If the person in the house is looking for the pearls, maybe they are looking for this key too. Maybe they broke the mirror because they thought the key was hidden behind the glass. "We must find that room before the sun goes down again," Mr. Reed said. They left the guest room and walked to the back of the villa. They found the heavy wooden door that led to the cellar. Mr. Reed pushed the door open. The air that came from the stairs was very cold. It smelled like wet stone and earth. He turned on his flashlight. The bright beam of light showed stone steps going down into the deep darkness. "Wait," Elena whispered. She pointed to the floor near the door frame. There was a small piece of white thread caught on a sharp nail. Mr. Reed picked it up. It was a piece of white cloth. It looked exactly like the material of the sheets that covered the furniture and the paintings. The person is using the white sheets to move in the shadows. Mr. Reed said quietly, "They want to look like a ghost." They began to walk down the stone steps. Every step took them deeper under the house. The silver key felt heavy in Mr. Reed's pocket. It was their first real clue, but it also made them a target. Mr. Reed and Elena stood at the bottom of the cellar stairs. The air was thick and cold. Suddenly, they heard a new sound from above. It was not a footstep or a moving chair. It was a deep, low rumble in the sky. A few seconds later, the first drops of rain hit the high windows of the villa. The rain grew stronger very quickly. It was not a light summer rain. It was a fierce, heavy storm. The water hit the stone walls with great force. Inside the cellar, the sound was like a constant, heavy rhythm on the ground above them. Mr. Reed looked up at a small, high window near the ceiling. The glass was covered in a curtain of water. "We should go back up," Mr. Reed said. "The cellar might be dangerous if the water gets inside." They climbed the stone steps and returned to the main hallway. The house was now very dark. The grey clouds outside were so thick that the afternoon looked like night. Mr. Reed walked to the large front door and looked out of a narrow side window. His heart sank. The long, yellow grass of the garden was now a lake of brown water. The narrow road he used to drive here was gone. It was covered by a fast-moving river of mud and rocks. The storm was washing the hillside away. "The road is flooded," Mr. Reed told Elena. She came to the window and gasped. "We cannot leave the villa. The car would be swept away by the mud. So we are trapped," Elena whispered. She looked at the dark hallway behind them. "Trapped in the house with whoever is here." Mr. Reed tried to stay calm. "We have food, and the walls are thick stone. We are safe from the storm. We just need to stay together." The wind pushed against the house. It made a long, whistling sound as it moved through the cracks in the old windows. Suddenly, a bright flash of light filled the room. For 1 second, the hallway was white. Mr. Reed saw the faceless paintings clearly. Then, the light disappeared. A massive sound followed, like a giant rock falling from the sky. The whole house shook. "That was very close," Mr. Reed said. He noticed a small stream of water coming from under the library door. The roof or a window inside must be leaking. The water was moving across the floor, wetting the old wooden boards. "The library is getting wet," he said. "The old books will be destroyed." He looked at the door. He felt a sudden desire to open it. The storm was a problem, but it was also a distraction. Perhaps the person in the house was also worried about the rain. This was the perfect time to find a way into that room. He reached into his pocket and felt the silver key. Then he looked at the library's smaller lock. He knew the silver key was for a chest, not a door. But he felt that the answers were waiting behind that dark wood. The rain continued to fall with great force. Mr. Reed and Elena stood in the dark hallway, watching the water move across the floor. It was a small, steady stream coming from under the library door. Mr. Reed walked toward the door. He expected it to be locked, just like before. He reached out his hand and touched the cold metal handle. To his surprise, the handle turned easily. The lock was no longer holding the door shut. Mr. Reed looked at Elena. Her face was pale in the dim light. He pushed the door slowly. It moved without a sound. The room inside was very large and very dark. He turned on his flashlight and moved the beam of light around the room. The library was magnificent. It was much larger than the other rooms in the villa. Every wall was covered with tall wooden shelves. The shelves reached all the way to the high ceiling. There were thousands of books. The air was thick with the smell of old paper, leather, and salt. My uncle spent all his time here." Elena whispered. She stepped into the room and looked around with sad eyes. He said the books were his only true friends after he left the sea. Mr. Reed walked to the nearest shelf. He looked at the titles of the books. They were all about the same subject. He saw books about the Atlantic Ocean, the history of famous ships, and the science of the stars. There were large journals full of handwritten notes about wind speeds and deep water currents. Many of the books had small drawings of anchors and sails on their covers. "These are not just books," Mr. Reed said. "This is a captain's collection." He was obsessed with the ocean. He moved his flashlight to a large desk in the center of the room. The desk was made of a dark, heavy wood. On top of the desk, there was a large globe of the world. Next to the globe, a set of old maps was spread out. The maps were wet. The water from the leaking roof was dripping directly onto them. Mr. Reed looked up. A small window high in the wall was broken. The rain was blowing inside. This was why the water was moving into the hallway. He walked to the desk to move the maps, but he stopped. He saw something strange. Among the books about ships, there was a small stack of papers. They were not about the sea. They were legal documents. He saw the name Mr. Grant written in bold letters at the bottom of a page. He also saw the name of the villa. "Elena, look at this," he called out. But as Elena walked toward the desk, she tripped on something. She did not fall, but she moved a heavy rug with her foot. Under the rug, the wooden floor was dark. There was a small, square piece of wood that looked different from the others. Mr. Reed moved his light to the floor. The library was full of knowledge, but it was also hiding something physical. They were very close to another secret. Mr. Reed knelt on the floor. He used the flat metal tool from his bag. He pushed it into the gap around the small square piece of wood. The wood was wet from the rain, so it was soft. He pulled it up slowly. Under the floorboard, there was a small, dark hole. It was a secret compartment. He moved his flashlight closer. At first, he saw only dust and a small spider. But then, he saw a flash of white. He reached his hand into the cold hole. He pulled out a small object. It was a glove. The glove was made of fine, white silk. It was very elegant, the kind of glove a lady would wear to a fancy dinner. But it was not clean. On the tip of the pointer finger, there was a large, dark spot. The spot was dry and hard. It was not brown like mud or black like ink. It was a deep, dark red. "Is that blood?" Elena whispered. She moved back a step. Her face was very pale in the flashlight's beam. Mr. Reed looked at the stain carefully. "It looks like it," he said. "It is old, but it is definitely a stain from a liquid, and it is only on this one finger." He turned the glove over. On the inside of the wrist, there was a small name tag. It was sewn into the silk with very small, neat stitches. It said, "S. Grant." Mr. Reed felt a cold chill. Grant. That is the lawyer's name. But this is a woman's glove. Elena said. The lawyer is a man. Maybe he has a wife. Or a sister. Mr. Grant told me he was alone. Mr. Reed remembered. He said there were no family members. But this glove proves someone else was here. Someone with the same name. And something happened to them. Mr. Reed put the glove into a plastic bag from his toolkit. He did not want to touch the stain anymore. He looked back into the secret hole. There was one more thing inside. It was a small, empty glass bottle. The label was gone, but the bottle smelled like a very strong chemical. It was a sharp, cleaning smell that made his eyes water. Someone tried to clean something. Mr. Reed said. Or maybe they used this chemical to hurt someone. Suddenly, the library door moved. It did not open more, but it shook in its frame. The wind was howling outside, and the house felt like it was breathing. Mr. Reed stood up and grabbed his flashlight. He felt like they were standing in a room full of ghosts and secrets. "We need to leave the library," he told Elena. "The storm is getting worse, and we are too open here. Let's go to the small office near the kitchen. I want to check the desk there again." As they walked out of the library, Mr. Reed looked at the faceless paintings in the hall. In the dark, the holes where the faces used to be looked like deep, black tunnels. He felt that the stained glove was the key to a much bigger crime. The lawyer, Mr. Grant, was not just a liar. He was a man with a very dark past. The storm continued to beat against the stone walls of the black villa. Mr. Reed and Elena walked quickly to the small office near the kitchen. This room was cold and smelled like old ink. There was a simple wooden desk in the center of the room. Mr. Reed began to search the desk. He opened the top drawer. It was full of empty envelopes and broken pens. He opened the second drawer. It was empty. He pulled the third drawer all the way out. He looked at the back of the desk. He noticed that the drawer was shorter than the space inside the desk. "There is a gap here," he told Elena. He reached his hand into the dark space behind the wood. He felt a small, metal lever. He pushed it to the side. A small, hidden compartment opened at the side of the desk. Inside, something was glowing with a faint blue light. Mr. Reed reached in and pulled out a modern mobile phone. It was thin and black. It looked very expensive and very new. It was a strange thing to find in such an old, dusty house. "A phone?" Elena asked. "Mr. Grant told me there was no signal here. He said the old radio was the only way to talk to the world." Mr. Reed looked at the screen. The battery was very low. There was one notification on the display. It said, "One missed call. The boss." The boss. Mr. Reed whispered. If Mr. Grant is the lawyer, who is he working for? Who is the boss? He tried to open the phone, but it was locked with a secret code. He looked at the time on the screen. The missed call happened only 1 hour ago. That meant the person in the house was using this phone very recently. They were talking to someone outside, even during the storm. Suddenly, the phone began to move. It vibrated against Mr. Reed's hand. The screen lit up again. The name "The Boss" appeared in large, white letters. The phone was ringing. Mr. Reed and Elena stayed very still. They did not answer the call. They watched the screen until it went dark again. The room felt even smaller now. They realized that Mr. Grant was not working alone. There was a bigger plan, and a bigger person in charge. "We need to be very careful," Mr. Reed said. "This phone is a link to the truth, but it also shows that the person in the house is still active. They are waiting for instructions." He put the phone into his pocket. He wanted to keep it safe. Just then, he heard a new noise. It was not the rain. It was the sound of a voice. It was coming from outside, near the cliff. The voice was loud and angry. Someone was shouting over the wind. Mr. Reed grabbed his flashlight and moved toward the window. The mystery was moving out of the shadows and into the light of the storm. Mr. Reed looked at Elena. She looked very scared when she heard the voice outside. "Stay here," she whispered to him. "I will go and see who it is. Maybe it is the police." Before Mr. Reed could say a word, Elena ran out of the office and disappeared into the dark hallway. Mr. Reed did not stay in the office. He felt a bad feeling in his chest. He did not think the police were outside. He followed Elena quietly. He did not turn on his flashlight. He moved like a shadow against the stone walls. He reached the back door of the kitchen. It was wide open. The cold rain blew into the room, making the floor wet and slippery. He stepped outside into the storm. The wind was so strong that he almost fell. He moved toward the edge of the cliff, hiding behind large rocks and thick bushes. He saw two people standing near the jagged edge of the mountain. The rain made it hard to see their faces, but their shapes were clear. One was the tall, thin lawyer, Mr. Grant. The other was Elena. They were not acting like strangers. They were standing close together and arguing. Their voices were loud, trying to be heard over the sound of the crashing waves below. Mr. Reed stayed behind a large stone pillar and listened. "Where is the silver key?" Mr. Grant shouted. He looked very angry. He was waving his arms in the air. "You were supposed to find it in the garden. I told you, the rain changed everything." Elena replied. Her voice was not soft or kind anymore. It was sharp and cold. "The dirt moved. I found the key, but the architect was there. I had to act like a friend to him." "The boss is losing his patience," Mr. Grant said. He stepped closer to her. "He wants those pearls tonight. If that architect finds the secret room first, we are in trouble. We cannot let him leave this house with the truth. He is just a man," Elena said with a cruel laugh. "He thinks I am a poor, sad niece. He is probably hiding in the office right now, shaking with fear. He knows nothing about our plan." "Good," Grant said. "Keep him busy. If he starts to ask too many questions, we must stop him. We cannot have any witnesses." Mr. Reed felt a wave of cold fear, and it was not because of the rain. His heart beat very fast. Elena was a liar. She was not the niece of the owner. She was working with Mr. Grant. They were both thieves looking for the famous pearls. And now, they were a danger to his life. He realized he was completely alone. He could not trust the woman he was trying to help. He moved back toward the house slowly and carefully. He did not want to make a sound. If they saw him now, he knew they would not let him go. He entered the kitchen and locked the door. He ran back to the office and held the secret phone tightly. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. Mr. Reed stood in the middle of the dark office, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The realization that Elena and Mr. Grant were partners in crime felt like a physical blow to his stomach. He wasn't just an architect hired for repairs anymore. He was an obstacle, a witness they clearly didn't want. He hurried to the window, his breath coming in short, jagged gasps. He needed to leave. He didn't care about the contract, the money, or the history of the house. He just wanted to get into his car and drive until the black villa was nothing more than a bad memory. He wiped the thick fog from the glass and peered out into the torrential rain. The spot near the iron gate was empty. At first, he thought the storm had simply pushed the vehicle over the cliffside. But then, a massive flash of lightning illuminated the driveway for a split second. He saw deep, fresh ruts in the thick mud. The tracks didn't lead toward the cliff. They led toward the old stone carriage house tucked away at the back of the property. They hadn't destroyed his car. They had hidden it to ensure he couldn't escape. "My keys," he whispered, his voice trembling. He reached into his coat pocket where he always kept them. His hand met only empty space. In the chaos of the kitchen, or perhaps during their friendly tea, Elena must have picked his pocket. He was a talented architect, but she was clearly a professional in a much darker trade. He was truly trapped. The house was a fortress, the sea was a wall of white foam, and the road was a river of sludge. His only assets were a silver key to a box he hadn't found, a stained silk glove, and a secret phone that didn't belong to him. He pulled the modern phone from his pocket. The blue light of the screen was incredibly bright in the dark office. He saw the battery icon in the corner. 1%. "No, no, no," he muttered, pressing his thumb against the glass. He tried to find a way to dial an emergency number, but the phone was still locked behind a passcode. He tried 1-2-3-4. Nothing. He tried 0-0-0-0. Nothing. The screen flickered, the light dimmed to a dull grey, and then the phone went completely black. The silence that followed was terrifying. He was alone in a room with no light, no way to call for help, and two people outside who were planning his disappearance. He heard the back door of the kitchen open. The heavy boots were back inside. Mr. Grant and Elena were no longer pretending to be strangers. They were coming for him. The sound of the heavy kitchen door closing was like a starter's pistol. Mr. Reed knew he had only seconds before Elena or Grant reached the office. He looked around the small, cramped room. There was no closet to hide in, and the desk was too small to provide any real cover. He looked up. In the dim light of his fading flashlight, he saw a square outline in the wooden ceiling. It was a hatch. A small, frayed piece of rope hung from a metal ring. It was an access point to the attic, a place the map had shown, but he hadn't yet explored. He grabbed a sturdy wooden chair and placed it under the hatch. Standing on his tiptoes, he reached for the rope. It was old and rough against his palms. He pulled hard. The wood groaned, a sound that felt loud enough to wake the entire coastline, and then a set of folded wooden stairs began to slide down. The ladder hit the floor with a soft thud. At the same time, he heard footsteps in the hallway. They were fast and purposeful. "Reed, are you in there?" It was Elena's voice. It no longer sounded kind or concerned. It was sharp, cold, and demanding. Mr. Reed didn't answer. He scrambled up the ladder, his boots slipping slightly on the dusty rungs. He reached the top and pulled himself into the pitch-black space of the attic. The air here was even colder, smelling of ancient dust and dry rot. He immediately reached down and grabbed the handle of the ladder, pulling it up as fast as he could. The mechanism was rusty and heavy. He gritted his teeth, his muscles straining. Just as the hatch clicked shut into the ceiling, he heard the office door open below. "He's not here." He heard Grant's deep voice growl. "The window is closed," Elena said. "He couldn't have gone outside without us seeing him. Look at the desk. The secret drawer is open." A heavy silence followed. Mr. Reed held his breath, pressing his chest against the cold attic floor. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, a frantic drum. "The phone," Grant hissed. He took the phone. "If he figures out the code or finds a way to charge it, we're finished. Find him. Elena. Now." Below him, the office became a flurry of activity. He heard drawers being ripped out and papers being tossed. He realized he was safe for the moment, but he was trapped once again. The attic was a vast, dark cavern filled with the skeletons of the villa's past. He turned his flashlight on, keeping the beam low. The attic was filled with old trunks, broken furniture, and piles of dusty paintings, the ones that hadn't made it to the hallway. He moved deeper into the shadows, his light hitting a large, leather-bound chest in the corner. It was locked with a heavy padlock, and on the lid, there was a familiar symbol, a rose. He reached into his pocket and felt the small silver key Elena had found in the garden. This was it. The attic wasn't just a hiding place. It was the vault. Mr. Reed crawled across the dusty floor toward the large leather chest. He moved slowly to keep the wooden boards from creaking. Below him, he could still hear the muffled, angry voices of Grant and Elena. They were moving from the office into the dining room. He didn't have much time. He reached the chest and touched the silver rose on the lid. His hands were damp with cold sweat. He took the small silver key from his pocket and inserted it into the heavy padlock. It fit perfectly. With a soft click, the lock popped open. He lifted the heavy lid, the leather hinges making a dry, stretching sound. Inside, The chest was lined with faded blue velvet. On top lay a thick, leather-bound book, the captain's logbook. Beneath it were several bundles of old letters and a small wooden box. But what caught Mr. Reed's eye was something completely out of place: a white portable power bank and a charging cable. They've been using this chest as a charging station. Reed whispered. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the power bank and plugged it into the black phone he had taken from the desk. A small green icon appeared on the screen. Charging. 2%. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He turned his attention back to the logbook. He opened it to the very last page. There was a hand-drawn family tree. He traced the lines with his finger. Captain Thomas had one sister, but she had died young and childless. Finding. There was no niece. Elena was definitely an imposter. As he flipped through the letters, a small, folded newspaper clipping fell out. It was dated 5 years ago. The headline read, "Local nurse missing after villa visit." Below the headline was a photo of a woman wearing the same white silk gloves he had found earlier. The caption identified her as Sarah Grant, the wife of the local estate lawyer. Mr. Reed felt a wave of nausea. The lawyer downstairs wasn't just a thief. He was likely a murderer who had replaced the real Mr. Grant years ago. The boss was directing a long-term operation to strip the villa of its secrets. Suddenly, the phone in his hand vibrated. A text message appeared on the screen. It was from the boss. Message: "The storm is at its peak. The boat is waiting in the cove. Finish the architect and bring the pearls now." Mr. Reed looked toward the dark, far corner of the attic. He saw a flash of white. At first, he thought it was another furniture sheet. But then, the white shape moved. It wasn't a sheet. It was a person wrapped in a thin, pale cloak, huddled against the chimney. A pair of bright, terrified eyes looked back at him from the shadows. Mr. Reed didn't move. He kept the flashlight beam pointed at the floor, letting only the edge of the light touch the figure in the corner. He didn't want to blind her or, worse, draw the attention of the two criminals downstairs. He crawled closer, the old wooden boards groaning under his weight. "Don't be afraid," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind against the roof. "I'm not with them. I'm Mr. Reed. I was hired to fix the house." The woman pulled the white cloak, which he now realized was one of the furniture sheets, away from her face. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, with dark, hollow eyes and hair tangled with cobwebs. She was shivering so violently that her teeth chattered. "I'm Elena," she breathed. Her voice was a thin, fragile thread. Mr. Reed froze. "But the woman downstairs. She told me she was Elena. She had the keys. She knew about the uncle. She's a liar." The girl hissed, a spark of anger appearing in her eyes. "She's my cousin's former nurse. Her name is Martha. She stole my identification papers and my car when I stopped at a rest area near the village. She must have been planning this for months. She and that man, that Mr. Grant, they trapped me here the moment I arrived." "Why didn't they just get rid of you?" Reed asked, though he feared the answer. "The pearls," the real Elena explained, clutching her arms. "My Uncle Thomas was very clever. He hid the white pearl of the sea in a place only a true family member could find. They need me to translate the clues in his journals. I escaped into the attic when they weren't looking, but the hatch is the only way out, and they've been guarding it." Mr. Reed looked at the black phone in his hand. The green light was still glowing. 4%. It was enough to send a text, but there was no signal in the attic. The thick stone chimneys and the lead roof were blocking it. "We have to get to the library window," Reed said. "Or the roof. Somewhere the signal can get out." "You found the silver key," Elena noticed, looking at the chest. That opens the inner sanctum in the cellar. That's where the pearls are. If they get that key, they don't need me anymore." Suddenly, a loud thump echoed from the floor below. Then came the sound of metal scraping against wood. Someone was trying to push the attic hatch open. It didn't move because Reed had pulled the ladder up, but they were using a tool to force the lock. "Reed. Elena. We know you're up there." Grant's voice boomed through the ceiling. It wasn't the voice of a lawyer anymore. It was the voice of a predator. "The storm isn't going to last forever. If you come down now with the key and the phone, we might let you walk to the village. If we have to come up there, things will get very messy." Mr. Reed looked at the real Elena. He saw the terror in her eyes. He looked at the heavy leather trunk. He realized they were cornered. He had to find another way out of the attic, and fast. The wood of the attic hatch groaned and splintered. A metal crowbar pushed through the gap, gleaming like a silver tooth in the dark. Mr. Reed knew the lock wouldn't hold for more than a minute. The fake Mr. Grant was a strong man, and his anger was making him even stronger. "There has to be another way out," Reed whispered, his flashlight darting across the rafters. "We can't go down the way we came up." The real Elena pointed to a massive, dust-caked wardrobe in the corner. It was made of dark mahogany and carved with the same sea monsters as the library door. "My uncle. He used to tell me stories about the hidden path of the navigator. He said the house was like a ship. It always had a back way to the bridge. He used to disappear from his study and show up in the kitchen in seconds." Reed rushed to the wardrobe. It was incredibly heavy, likely filled with old winter coats and mothballs. He pushed with all his might, his boots skidding on the grit-covered floorboards. It didn't budge. He felt along the side of the wood, his fingers searching for a catch, a lever, or a hidden button. He found a small wooden peg shaped like a tiny anchor near the base. He pressed it hard. With a sharp click that sounded like a gunshot in the silent attic, the entire back panel of the wardrobe swung inward. Behind it was a narrow, spiraling stone staircase that vanished into the pitch-black darkness below. "Go!" Reed urged. The real Elena scrambled into the opening, her white sheet cloak fluttering behind her. Reed followed, but not before grabbing the heavy leather trunk and dragging it with him. It was a struggle. The trunk was awkward and heavy, but he couldn't leave the captain's logbook or the power bank behind. They were his only leverage. Just as he stepped onto the first stone step, the attic hatch behind them finally gave way. He heard the wooden ladder crash down and the heavy, rhythmic thud of Grant's boots hitting the attic floor. "They're gone." He heard Grant roar, his voice echoing through the rafters. "The wardrobe. Check the wardrobe. They can't have gone far." Reed pulled the panel shut from the inside. A heavy iron bolt allowed him to lock it. They were now in a space barely wider than his shoulders. The air was freezing and smelled of ancient damp earth. The stairs were steep, narrow, and slick with moisture. "Where does this go?" Elena asked, her voice echoing softly against the cold stone. "According to the map I found," Reed replied, checking the yellowed paper in his pocket by the light of his flashlight. "This is a service staircase. It was built for the original servants to move through the house without being seen. It should lead us directly behind the walls of the library and down toward the cellar." They began their descent. The sounds of the storm were muffled here, replaced by the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of water leaking through the stone masonry. Every step was a risk. One slip would send them tumbling down the spiral. They were moving into the very heart of the villa, where the oldest secrets, and the most dangerous truths, were waiting to be uncovered. The spiral staircase felt like a stone throat, tightening around them as they descended. Mr. Reed held the heavy leather trunk in one arm, his muscles burning with the effort. Every time his boots scraped against the grit, he stopped, listening for the sound of the wardrobe panel being forced open above. So far, there was only the distant, muffled howling of the wind. After descending what felt like 2 floors, the staircase ended at a tiny, cramped landing. There was no door, only a solid wall of dark, vertical wooden planks. Mr. Reed ran his hand over the wood until he felt a small, circular indentation, a knot in the timber that had been intentionally hollowed out. He leaned forward and pressed his eye to the hole. He was looking directly into the library. The viewpoint was high up, hidden behind the shadows of the top shelf of the History of the Sea section. From here, he had a perfect view of the grand desk and the center of the room. Below him, the library was a scene of chaos. The fake Elena, Martha, was no longer the calm, collected woman he had met at the gate. She was frantic. She was throwing heavy, leather-bound books off the shelves, their pages fluttering like wounded birds as they hit the wet floor. "It has to be here," she screamed over the thunder. Thomas spent every waking hour in this room. He wouldn't have kept the map in the cellar. He was too frail to go down those stairs at the end. The fake Mr. Grant stood by the desk, his long coat dripping water onto the floor. He was holding a heavy iron pry bar. The architect found something under the floorboards earlier. "I saw the wood was moved. If he has the map, Martha, we're dead. The boss's boat is already circling the cove. If we don't have the pearls when the tide turns, he won't take us with him. He'll leave us here to face the police. The police can't get here." Martha laughed, a sharp, jagged sound. "The road is gone. But the boss, he doesn't like failure." Mr. Reed felt the real Elena tremble beside him. He placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. He looked back through the hole. Grant was now leaning over the large globe on the desk. He began to spin it violently, his eyes searching the surface for a hidden catch. "Wait," Martha said, her voice dropping to a hiss. She pointed toward the hallway. "Did you hear that? A door closing." Grant froze. He gripped the pry bar tightly. The cellar. He's going for the vault. He must have figured out the silver key. They both ran from the room, their footsteps echoing loudly on the hardwood floor until they reached the hallway. The library was left in silent, messy ruins. Mr. Reed pulled back from the hole. "They think I'm in the cellar," he whispered to the real Elena. "This is our chance. We need to get to the desk. If there's a map or a way to contact the outside world, it's in that room." He searched the wooden wall of the landing. He found a small iron ring hidden near the floor. He pulled it, and a section of the bookshelf swung outward like a silent door. They stepped out into the library, the smell of damp paper and old secrets filling their lungs. The hunt for the pearls was reaching its climax, but the storm was only getting started. The library was eerie in the flickering light of the storm. Without the fake Grant and Martha, the room felt like a tomb of forgotten knowledge. Mr. Reed and the real Elena hurried to the massive mahogany desk. The large globe sat there, still vibrating slightly from the fake Grant's violent spinning. He was looking for a catch. Reed whispered, his eyes scanning the colorful surface of the world. He knew the secret was in the geography. Reed leaned in closer. The globe was an antique, made of hand-painted paper and plaster. He looked for the silver sands name Elena had mentioned earlier. He found the coast of the local area, but the map on the globe was slightly different from the modern one in his pocket. Near the jagged line of the cliff, there was a tiny, raised gold leaf in the shape of a star. "Elena, look at the coordinates," Reed said, pointing his flashlight at the brass ring surrounding the globe. "The star is at a specific degree. My uncle was a navigator. He wouldn't just hide something, he would navigate to it. He tried to push the star, but it didn't move. He remembered the maritime books he had seen earlier. The science of the stars. He looked at the brass meridian, the metal ring that held the globe. It had numbers etched into the side. He turned the globe until the gold star lined up perfectly with the number for the villa's latitude. Suddenly, a faint click-clack echoed from inside the sphere. The globe didn't just spin anymore. It split. The northern hemisphere slid upward on a hidden track, revealing a hollow center. Inside the globe wasn't gold or jewels. It was a brass cylinder, about the size of a telescope, and a small, leather-wrapped object. Mr. Reed pulled the cylinder out. It was heavy. He unscrewed the cap and found a set of architectural blueprints, the original plans for the Black Villa's foundation. These aren't just repairs. Reed realized, spreading the papers on the wet desk. These plans show the structural weakness of the entire cliffside. My uncle wasn't just hiding a vault. He was hiding the fact that the house is sitting on a hollow cavern. One big storm, one high tide, and the whole villa could slide into the sea. That's why they want the pearls now. Elena gasped. They know the house won't survive the night. They want to take the treasure and let the sea take the evidence, including us. Reed picked up the second object from the globe. It was a small, high-powered satellite radio. Unlike the black phone, which relied on local towers that were likely destroyed by the storm, this device used a direct link to the sky. He turned it on. A small green light flickered to life. He adjusted the frequency dial, the static sounding like a swarm of bees in the quiet room. Mayday! Mayday! Reed spoke into the small receiver, his voice urgent. This is the Black Villa on the northern cliff. We are trapped by a flood and under threat by armed intruders. Do you copy? The radio crackled. A voice, distant and distorted by the storm, broke through. Receiving you. This is Coast Guard Station. State your coordinates. Before Reed could answer, the library door flew open. It didn't just open. It hit the wall with a deafening crash. The fake Mr. Grant stood there, his face twisted with a terrifying, wild grin. He wasn't holding the pry bar anymore. He was holding a heavy, black flare gun. Give me the radio. Architect. Grant hissed. And the girl. The tide is coming in, and I don't have time for games. The library felt smaller than it had seconds ago. The fake Mr. Grant stood in the doorway, the heavy flare gun leveled at Mr. Reed's chest. The orange light of the storm's lightning flickered behind him, casting a monstrous shadow across the ruined bookshelves. The radio. Grant repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Slide it across the desk. Slowly. If you try to call that Coast Guard again, I'll turn this library into a bonfire. I don't think you want to see how fast 100 years of dry paper burns. Mr. Reed looked at the real Elena. She was pressed against the mahogany desk, her eyes wide with terror. He then looked at the flare gun. It was a single-shot weapon, but at this range, it was lethal. More importantly, Grant was right. One spark would ignite the entire room. You won't fire it, Reed said, trying to keep his voice steady. He gripped the edge of the brass cylinder containing the blueprints. The boss wants the pearls, remember. If you burn the house down now, you'll never find the vault in the cellar. You'll be empty-handed when that boat arrives. Grant's eyes flickered with a moment of doubt. He knew Reed was right, but his desperation was winning. I don't need the vault if I have the girl. She'll tell me where they are once we're on the boat. Now, the radio. Suddenly, the floor beneath them groaned. It wasn't the usual creak of old wood. It was a deep, structural vibration that seemed to come from the very bedrock of the cliff. A stack of books on a nearby shelf slid off and hit the floor. The blueprints Reed had spread out began to slide toward the edge of the desk. Did you feel that? Reed shouted, seizing the moment of distraction. The blueprints. The house is sitting on a hollow cavern. Grant. The storm is washing the foundation away. If you don't leave now, the vault, the pearls, and you are all going into the Atlantic. Lies. Grant roared. He pulled the trigger. There was a deafening pop and a hiss. A bright, blindingly hot magnesium flare streaked across the room. It didn't hit Reed. He had dove to the floor, pulling Elena with him. The flare struck a tall stack of encyclopedias near the window. Immediately, a harsh, red light filled the room, accompanied by a thick, acrid cloud of smoke. The paper began to curl and blacken. The secret door. Reed yelled through the smoke. He grabbed the satellite radio and the brass cylinder. In the confusion of the red glare and the rising smoke, he led Elena toward the section of the bookshelf that hid the spiral stairs. They scrambled through the opening just as Grant charged toward the desk, coughing and cursing. Reed slammed the bookshelf shut and engaged the iron ring. He heard Grant pounding on the wood from the other side. "We can't go back up." Elena gasped, clutching her throat. "The smoke will rise into the attic." "We're going down," Reed said, his face set in grim determination. "To the cellar. If the house is going to fall, I want to be in the one place that might actually lead to the sea level tunnels. We find the pearls, and we find a way out through the cliff." As they walked down the dark, narrow stairs again, the house shook once more, longer and harder this time. The black villa was screaming, and the sea was ready to answer. The secret stairs felt like they were shrinking. Every time the house groaned, dust and small pebbles fell from the ceiling of the stone shaft. Mr. Reed kept his flashlight pointed down, the beam reflecting off the damp, slick walls. Behind them, he could hear the muffled roar of the fire in the library, a hungry beast trapped behind a wooden wall. "We're below sea level now," Elena whispered. Her voice echoed, sounding hollow and strange. She was right. The air didn't just smell like damp earth anymore. It smelled of salt and rotting seaweed. A rhythmic, heavy thud, thud, thud vibrated through the stone. It was the sound of the Atlantic Ocean hammering against the base of the cliff. They reached the bottom of the spiral. Instead of a wardrobe, there was a simple, heavy iron door. Mr. Reed pushed it open, and they stepped out into a part of the cellar he hadn't seen before. This wasn't the open area with coal bins and old boxes. This was a narrow corridor lined with thick stone pillars. "Look at the floor," Reed said, pointing his light downward. A thin layer of dark, freezing water was already swirling around their boots. It wasn't coming from a leak in the roof. It was bubbling up from the cracks in the floorboards. The hollow cavern from the blueprints wasn't just a theory. The sea was already inside the house. "The inner sanctum," Elena said, pointing to a door at the end of the corridor. Unlike the other doors in the villa, this one was made of solid white marble. In the center was a small, circular lock surrounded by a carving of a rose. It was the match for the silver key. But as they moved toward it, a shadow stepped out from behind a stone pillar. It was Martha, the fake Elena. She looked bedraggled, her blonde hair plastered to her face by the rain, but her eyes were bright with a desperate, manic light. She was holding a heavy kitchen knife. "The key, Reed," she said, her voice surprisingly calm despite the chaos. "I saw you take it from the garden. Give it to me, and I'll tell Grant to let you use the boat. The boss only needs the pearls. He doesn't care about the bodies. The boss isn't coming for you, Martha," Reed said, slowly reaching into his pocket, not for the key, but for the brass cylinder. "Look at the water. Look at the walls. This house is a sinking ship. Do you really think a professional thief is going to risk his boat in these waves for 2 failed henchmen?" Martha's hand shook. She looked down at the water rising over her ankles. For a second, her confidence wavered. Suddenly, a massive wave hit the cliff outside. The sound was like a bomb going off. A large crack appeared in the stone pillar next to Martha, and a jet of high-pressure seawater sprayed into the room, knocking her off her feet. "Now!" Reed yelled. He grabbed Elena's hand and ran past the gasping Martha. He reached the marble door and shoved the silver key into the lock. It turned with a smooth, mechanical hiss. The marble slab swung inward, revealing a small, dry room filled with the glint of gold and the soft, iridescent glow of 1,000 treasures. But in the center, on a pedestal of dark wood, sat a simple velvet box. The white pearl of the sea was finally within reach, but the door behind them was now the only thing keeping the ocean at bay. The inner sanctum was a small, circular room carved directly into the heart of the cliff's granite. Unlike the rest of the flooded cellar, the floor here was dry and covered in a thick, ornate rug. The walls were lined with small wooden cubbies containing journals, navigational instruments, and a small collection of gold coins. Mr. Reed grabbed the velvet box from the pedestal. He flipped the latch. Resting on a bed of black silk was the white pearl of the sea. It was the size of a bird's egg, glowing with a ghostly, milky light that seemed to pulse in time with the crashing waves outside. "We have it," Elena breathed, her eyes reflecting the pearl's glow. "But how do we get out?" "The water outside that door is already waist deep." Mr. Reed didn't look at the door. He looked at the floor behind the pedestal. He remembered the blueprints. The navigator's exit wasn't a staircase. It was a drainage shaft designed to keep the vault dry. He kicked the rug aside, revealing a heavy iron grate. "Through here," Reed said. "It leads to the lower tunnels. If we can reach the cove before the house collapses, we might have a chance." Suddenly, a shadow blocked the light from the marble doorway. Mr. Grant stood there, his clothes scorched from the library fire and his face a mask of mud and fury. He was no longer holding the flare gun. Instead, he gripped a heavy, old-fashioned diving knife he had snatched from a display case upstairs. "The pearl, Reed," Grant growled, stepping into the dry room. "And the blueprints. I don't care about Martha, and I don't care about the boss. That pearl is my retirement." "The house is falling, Grant," Reed shouted, pointing to a massive crack spreading across the marble ceiling. "Look up. The library is directly above us, and it's currently a furnace. The heat is expanding the stone. This whole wing is going to drop into the cellar in minutes." A crack echoed through the room. A piece of the marble ceiling fell, shattering the wooden pedestal. Grant didn't flinch. He lunged forward, the knife gleaming. Mr. Reed swung the heavy leather trunk he was still carrying. It hit Grant in the chest, sending the man stumbling back into the flooded corridor. At that exact moment, the structural failure reached its limit. The floor of the library above gave way. A cascade of burning books, scorched timber, and heavy furniture began to pour through the ceiling of the inner sanctum. "Down! Now!" Reed yelled, grabbing the edge of the iron grate. He and Elena heaved the heavy metal lid open. Below was a narrow, vertical shaft with rusted iron rungs. As they scrambled into the hole, Reed looked back one last time. He saw Grant struggling to stand in the rising water, his eyes fixed not on them, but on the white pearl tucked safely in Reed's jacket pocket. Then, the ceiling completely collapsed, burying the inner sanctum in a mountain of fire and stone. The drainage shaft was a tight, vertical tunnel of slime and cold air. Mr. Reed and Elena climbed down the rusted rungs as the world above them screamed. The collapse of the library and the inner sanctum shook the very bones of the cliff. Finally, their feet hit soft, wet sand. They were in a sea cave at the base of the villa. The tide was high, and the Atlantic was surging into the cavern, the spray hitting their faces with the force of gravel. Through the jagged opening of the cave, Reed saw a sleek, dark motorboat idling in the rough water. A man stood on the deck, dressed in a heavy yellow slicker, holding a pair of binoculars. "The boss. He's waiting for the signal," Reed yelled over the roar of the surf. He pulled out the satellite radio. It was battered and wet, but the green light was still blinking. "Don't," Elena said, grabbing his arm. "If he sees us and not Grant, he'll know the plan failed. He'll just leave." "I'm not signaling him," Reed replied. He adjusted the frequency one last time. Mayday, mayday. This is Reed. We are in the sea cave directly below the villa. The house is collapsing. We have 2 suspects on a dark motorboat in the cove. Do you copy? A clear, booming voice broke through the static. Copy that, Reed. This is Coast Guard Cutter Sentinel. We are rounding the northern point now. We have you on radar. Stay clear of the vessel in the cove. Suddenly, a sound like 1,000 thunderclaps erupted from above. Reed and Elena looked up. The Black Villa, the imposing, dark fortress that had stood for a century, finally gave up its fight against the Earth. The structural weakness Reed had found in the blueprints was the fatal blow. The entire west wing, including the library and the vault, slid down the cliffside in a slow-motion avalanche of stone and fire. The debris hit the water, sending a wall of white foam toward the boss's boat. The dark vessel was tossed like a toy, its engine screaming as the pilot tried to steer away from the falling masonry. But it was too late. From the darkness of the rain emerged the bright, sweeping searchlights of the Coast Guard. The Sentinel was a massive, white and orange beast, cutting through the waves. Stay back. Reed pulled Elena into a high crevice in the cave wall as the water rushed in. 20 minutes later, a rescue Zodiac from the Sentinel navigated the treacherous rocks of the cave. 2 sailors in helmets helped them into the boat. As they were pulled toward the safety of the larger ship, Reed looked back. The Black Villa was gone. Only a jagged, empty scar remained on the cliffside. The Mr. Grant and Martha were gone with it, buried under the stone they had tried so hard to rob. The boss's boat was being boarded by armed officers just a few hundred yards away. Epilogue. 2 days later, the sun finally broke through the clouds. Mr. Reed sat on a bench in the small village harbor, a hot cup of coffee in his hands. His car had been found in the carriage house, undamaged, and his keys were returned by the police after they processed the fake Elena. The real Elena sat beside him. She looked different now, clean, rested, and wearing a coat that actually belonged to her. In her hand, she held the velvet box. The police said the pearl belongs to the estate, she said softly. But since I am the only legal heir, it stays with me. My uncle's journals were found in the debris that washed ashore. They prove everything. What will you do with it? Reed asked. Elena looked out at the calm, blue horizon where the villa once stood. I'm going to sell it. Not for the money, but to build something new. A lighthouse. Right on that cliff. So no more ships, or people, get lost at the Black Villa. Reed smiled and stood up. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his architectural pen. If you're looking for an architect to design a lighthouse, I might know someone who's looking for work. Elena laughed, a real, warm sound this time. I think you've seen enough of that cliff for a lifetime, Mr. Reed. But I'd be honored. The mystery of the Black Villa was over. The secrets were at the bottom of the sea, and for the first time in 100 years, the coast was finally clear. The morning sun felt like a stranger's hand on Mr. Reed's shoulder. It was too bright and too calm for a world that had, only 48 hours ago, been a nightmare of collapsing stone and rising tides. He sat on the porch of the Anchor's Rest, the only inn in the small coastal village of St. Jude's. His hands were wrapped around a mug of coffee, but he wasn't drinking. He was watching the police tape flutter in the breeze down at the harbor. The village was small, a cluster of whitewashed cottages clinging to the hillside like barnacles. Usually, the only news here was the price of fish or the arrival of the mail boat. Now, the streets were filled with black and white police cruisers and men in suits carrying briefcases. They were federal agents, and they were asking questions that the local fishermen couldn't answer. Elena walked onto the porch and sat in the chair next to him. She looked tired, her eyes underlined with dark circles, but the frantic terror was gone. She was holding a manila folder. The detectives finished their first interview with the man they caught on the boat, she said. Her voice was low. Reed finally took a sip of the cold coffee. The boss? No. Elena shook her head. He's just the pilot. A hired hand from across the channel. He claims he was told to pick up 3 passengers and a package. He says he never met the person who hired him. Everything was done through encrypted messages and dead drops of cash. Reed sighed, looking out at the empty space on the cliff where the black villa used to be. And Grant? Or the woman? Nothing, she replied. The divers went down yesterday when the tide was low. They found the library section, but it's buried under 30 feet of granite. The current is too strong to move the rubble right now. As far as the law is concerned, they are missing and presumed dead. Reed didn't feel relieved. He remembered the look in the fake Grant's eyes, the desperate, animalistic hunger for the pearl. Men like that didn't just disappear. And the boss? Elena opened the folder. Inside was a single piece of thermal paper, a receipt found in the pilot's pocket. It wasn't for fuel or supplies. It was a docking fee for a private marina 300 miles north, in a city known for its high-stakes antique auctions. At the bottom was a signature, but it wasn't a name. It was a small, hand-drawn symbol, a circle with a horizontal line through it. The Greek letter theta, Reed whispered, his architectural training recognizing the symbol for dimension or void. It's more than a letter, Elena said. The lead investigator told me they've seen this mark before. It's the brand of the Syndicate of the Sunken Rose. They aren't just thieves, Reed. They are collectors of lost history. They find items that shouldn't exist, like the White Pearl, and they erase them from the world. Reed looked at the folder. He realized the storm hadn't ended. It had just moved inland. He had been hired to fix a house, but he had accidentally stumbled into a global game of hide-and-seek. They won't stop because the house fell, Reed said, his eyes hardening. They think we still have the blueprints, the radio, and the journals. They think we know the rest of the locations. The rest? Elena asked, leaning in. Reed pulled the brass cylinder from his bag. He hadn't told the police about the blueprints yet. He unrolled them on the table. In the margin of the foundation map, hidden under a layer of dried salt, were 3 sets of GPS coordinates. None of them pointed to the Black Villa. One was in the heart of the city, another was in a forest to the west, and the third was in the middle of the ocean. My uncle didn't just build one house, Elena whispered, realization dawning on her. He built a network. The blueprints were more than just a map of stone and mortar. They were a confession written in the language of an architect. Mr. Reed laid the papers flat on the scarred wooden table of the inn's porch, using his heavy mug and a smooth sea stone to keep the corners from curling in the salt breeze. Elena leaned over his shoulder, her breath hitching as she traced the fine, ink-stained lines. My uncle was a man of patterns. She whispered. He used to say that a house is a body, but the secrets are the soul. I never understood what he meant until now. Reed pointed to the first set of coordinates scrawled in the margin. This one, he said, his finger tapping the paper. It isn't in some remote cliffside or a hidden cave. It's right in the center of the capital. According to the grid, it's the site of the old St. Sebastian clock tower. Elena frowned. The clock tower? That's a tourist landmark. It's been standing since the Great Fire. Why would a sea captain hide something in the middle of a busy city? It's not about the tower itself. Reed replied, his professional eye catching a detail he had missed in the dim light of the villa. Look at the way the lines are drawn. He didn't just mark the coordinates. He drew a structural cross-section of the tower's foundation. But he added something that shouldn't be there. A sub-basement. A hollow space deep beneath the clock's weights. As they spoke, the morning silence was broken. A sleek, black SUV with tinted windows pulled into the gravel lot of the Anchor's Rest. It didn't look like a police vehicle. It was too clean, too expensive, and it didn't have any official markings. The doors stayed closed, the engine idling with a low, predatory sound. Reed felt a familiar prickle of ice at the back of his neck. "Don't look at the car," he said softly, sliding the blueprints back into the brass cylinder with a practiced, quick motion. "Gather your things. We can't stay in St. Jude's." "But the police," Elena started. "The police are busy with the wreckage at the cliff," Reed interrupted. "And the syndicate. They have resources we haven't even seen yet. If they're here, it means the pilot wasn't the only one watching us. They want these coordinates, and they won't care about the missing status of Grant and Martha." They moved quickly and quietly back into the inn. Reed paid the bill in cash, keeping his head down as the innkeeper chatted about the weather. They exited through the kitchen, a trick Reed had learned from his days on high-stress construction sites where he had to avoid angry contractors. They reached his car, which was parked behind a row of tall hedges. As Reed turned the key, he checked the rear-view mirror. The black SUV was still in the lot, but the driver's side door was now open. A tall man in a grey suit was standing there, looking directly at the inn's porch where they had been sitting moments before. He was holding a small, silver device, a directional microphone. "They heard us," Reed hissed, throwing the car into gear. "They know about the clock tower." He swung the car onto the narrow coastal road, the tires kicking up a cloud of grey dust. The peaceful silence of the village was now behind them, replaced by the white-knuckle tension of the open road. The mystery of the Black Villa had officially expanded. They weren't just protecting a pearl anymore. They were racing to find a piece of history that a global syndicate was willing to kill for. "How far to the city?" Elena asked, clutching her seatbelt. 4 hours, Reed said, his eyes fixed on the road. "But we're taking the back routes. We need to reach that tower before they do, or the void is going to swallow more than just my career." The drive to the capital was a blur of grey asphalt and winding secondary roads. Mr. Reed kept his speed steady, never fast enough to attract the highway patrol, but never slow enough to let a shadow linger in his rearview mirror. Elena sat in the passenger seat, the brass cylinder clutched in her lap like a sacred relic. Every few miles, she would look back, her eyes searching the horizon for a flash of black paint or the glare of a pursuit vehicle. By the time they reached the city outskirts, the sun was beginning to dip behind the skyline of glass and steel. The capital was a frantic contrast to the salt spray silence of the Black Villa. Thousands of lights flickered to life, and the air was thick with the smell of exhaust and expensive perfume. "The St. Sebastian Clock Tower is in the old district," Reed said, navigating the labyrinth of one-way streets. "It's surrounded by modern bank buildings now. It's like a piece of the 19th century trapped in a cage of the 21st. He parked 3 blocks away in a cramped, multi-story garage. They didn't take the main streets. Reed led Elena through a series of narrow alleys, using his knowledge of urban layouts to stay out of the direct line of sight of the street cameras. He felt the weight of the satellite radio in his pocket, a dead device in the city's interference, but a reminder of the storm they had survived. They reached the square. The clock tower stood tall and imposing, its stone face darkened by decades of urban soot. The great bell struck the hour, 7 deep, resonant chimes that seemed to vibrate through the very pavement. "There's a guard at the main entrance," Elena whispered, nodding toward a man in a blue uniform standing by the heavy iron doors. "We aren't going in the front," Reed replied. He moved toward a small, inconspicuous metal door near the base of the tower's north side. It was marked "Maintenance. Authorized personnel only." Reed pulled a small set of professional lockpicks from his bag. It was a tool he rarely used, reserved for when a client lost the keys to an old site, but tonight his hands were steady. Within seconds, the tumblers clicked. They slipped inside, the heavy door muffling the roar of the city traffic. The air inside the tower was stagnant and smelled of oil and cold stone. Huge, rusted iron gears turned slowly above them, the mechanical heartbeat of the clock echoing through the hollow space. Reed ignored the stairs leading up to the bell chamber. Instead, he pulled back a heavy, oil-stained rug in the corner of the maintenance room. Beneath it was a heavy steel plate, bolted into the concrete. Reed checked the blueprint again by the light of his small torch. My uncle didn't just build the foundation. He muttered. He reinforced it. This plate covers the access to the sub-level 0. He began to unscrew the bolts, but as the third one came free, a light began to flash on a security keypad they hadn't noticed. Silent alarm. Reed hissed. We have 5 minutes, maybe less. He worked with a frantic intensity, the metal bolts clattering onto the floor. As the last one popped, he heaved the plate back. Below wasn't a crawl space, it was a finished stone room, perfectly dry and lined with shelves of antique maritime clocks. In the center of the room, on a small wooden pedestal, sat a silver compass with a needle that spun in a slow, hypnotic circle, never pointing north. It's the second relic. Elena gasped. But before they could descend, the maintenance door behind them was kicked open. The man in the grey suit stood there, his face illuminated by the flickering red alarm light. He wasn't alone. 2 other men, dressed in tactical gear, moved into the room with practiced precision. Mr. Reed, the man in the grey suit said, his voice as smooth as silk. You really should have stayed in the village. The city is a very dangerous place for an architect out of his depth. The grey-suited man, whom the tactical team called Director Vane, stepped further into the maintenance room. The red alarm light pulsed against his pale skin, making him look like a flickering ghost. Mr. Reed stood his ground over the open hatch, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Elena was frozen beside him, her hand gripping the brass cylinder so tightly her knuckles were white. The syndicate doesn't like to be kept waiting, Mr. Reed, Vane said, his voice cutting through the heavy thrum of the clock gears above. You have something that belongs to a much larger narrative than your small life can handle. The compass, please. And the blueprints. Let's not make this messy. Reed looked down into the hidden chamber. The silver compass sat on its pedestal, the needle spinning uselessly, or perhaps, pointing to something that wasn't geographic. He knew that if he handed it over, he and Elena would become loose ends, the same fate that had likely befallen the real Sarah Grant. You're not here for history, Vane, Reed said, shifting his weight. You're here for the power these things represent. My uncle didn't just collect relics, he built a system to keep them away from people like you. Vane smiled, a thin, mirthless line. Your uncle was a romantic. He thought he could bury the truth in stone and salt. But stone erodes, and salt dissolves. The void is patient. One of the tactical men moved forward, reaching for the brass cylinder in Elena's hand. In that split second, the clock tower's massive bell struck the half-hour. The vibration was immense, shaking the floor and causing the heavy maintenance tools on the wall to rattle. Reed didn't hesitate. He didn't reach for a weapon, he reached for the heavy iron weight that hung from the ceiling, part of the clock's manual winding system. He pulled the release lever. The weight, a massive block of lead, dropped. It slammed into the floor between Reed and the tactical team, shattering the concrete and sending a cloud of dust and debris into the air. The impact was so great that the floor groaned, the structural weakness Reed had noted in the blueprints finally coming into play. Jump! Reed yelled, grabbing Elena's arm. They didn't use the stairs. They dropped through the hatch into the sub-basement just as the floor above them began to buckle under the weight of the lead block. They landed hard on the stone floor of the hidden room, the air thick with dust. Above, he could hear Vane shouting orders, followed by the sound of boots hitting the floor. But the falling debris had partially blocked the hatch. They had seconds. Reed scrambled to the pedestal. He didn't just grab the compass. He saw a small indentation on the side of the wooden stand. He pressed it, and a section of the wall behind the shelves slid open. It wasn't a staircase this time. It was a metal slide, an old coal chute that led even deeper into the city's forgotten infrastructure. In. Now. They slid into the darkness, the sound of the clock tower's mechanical heartbeat fading above them. The chute was cold and slick with centuries of grime. They twisted and turned through the dark, eventually spilling out into a damp, brick-lined tunnel. Reed shone his light around. The air was foul, and the sound of rushing water echoed from the distance. They were in the Great Interceptor, the city's Victorian source system. The compass, Elena gasped, breathless. Did you get it? Reed opened his hand. The silver compass was there, but its needle had stopped spinning. It was now pointing steadily toward the south wall of the tunnel. It's not broken, Reed whispered, watching the needle vibrate with a strange energy. It's locked onto the next coordinate. We're not just following a map anymore, Elena. We're being led. The Great Interceptor was a cathedral of filth. Built in the 1860s, the vaulted brick tunnels stretched for miles beneath the capital's glittering surface. Water, black and oily, rushed through the center of the channel, the sound a constant, low-frequency roar. Mr. Reed held his flashlight high, the beam reflecting off the damp, moss-covered walls. We can't stay on the main path, Reed whispered, his voice echoing hollowly. Vane's men will have the city's utility maps. They'll know exactly where this chute leads. Elena clutched her coat, her eyes darting toward the shadows. The compass. It's still pointing south. But there's nothing that way except more brick. Reed stepped closer to the southern wall. He didn't look at the bricks. He looked at the mortar. In a city where the ground was constantly shifting, the mortar in a 100-year-old tunnel should be cracked and stained. But here, in a small section behind a rusted iron ladder, the mortar was clean, a pale grey that suggested it had been applied much more recently. He pressed his palm against the wall. He didn't feel the cold of stone. He felt a faint, rhythmic vibration. It matched the pulsing of the silver compass in his other hand. It's a resonant lock, Reed muttered, his architectural mind piecing together the captain's genius. The compass isn't just a pointer. It's a key. The needle reacts to a specific frequency emitted by whatever is behind this wall. He held the compass against the clean mortar. The needle began to spin rapidly, glowing with a faint, blue luminescence. Suddenly, a series of mechanical clicks erupted from behind the masonry. A section of the wall, roughly the size of a door, recessed an inch and then slid sideways into a hidden pocket. Beyond the wall lay a clean, white-tiled corridor that looked more like a laboratory than a saw. The air was pressurized and smelled faintly of ozone. "This isn't Victorian," Elena said, stepping into the bright space. "This is modern. My uncle didn't just build these places, he maintained them," Reed replied. "He used his fortune to keep his network updated. This must be a relay station." They followed the corridor to a small room filled with glowing server racks and brass-encased gauges. In the center was a glass table with a digital display. As they approached, the display flickered to life, showing a map of the world. 3 points were illuminated: the ruins of the Black Villa, the St. Sebastian Clock Tower, and a third location deep in the Blackwood Forest. "The forest," Elena whispered. "That's where the family estate used to be before the Great War." A voice suddenly crackled through the room's speakers, distorted and ancient, yet unmistakably the voice of Captain Thomas. "If you are hearing this, the void has begun to settle. The pearl and the compass are but the first 2 seals. To stop the syndicate, you must reach the Arboretum of Shadows. But beware. Vane is not the master. He is merely the herald. The boss. The boss is someone you have already met." The message ended. Reed felt a cold dread settle in his gut. Someone you have already met. He thought back to the lawyer, the pilot, the village innkeeper, even the fake Elena. "Reed, look." Elena pointed to a monitor. The screen showed a live security feed from the tunnel they had just left. A group of tactical men in black gear were already at the hidden door, using a thermal drill to cut through the mechanism. "They found us," Reed said, grabbing the compass. "We have to find the exit to the surface. We're going to Blackwood." The exit from the relay station was a pneumatic lift that deposited them inside a hollowed-out oak tree on the outskirts of the city. As the hidden door in the trunk clicked shut, the sound of the city was replaced by the oppressive silence of the Blackwood forest. The trees here were ancient, their gnarled branches reaching upward like the fingers of a drowning giant. "The Arboretum," Elena whispered, her breath hitching in the cold night air. "My uncle used to tell me it was a place where time didn't move forward, only in circles." Mr. Reed checked the silver compass. The needle was no longer pointing. It was vibrating with such intensity that it hummed. They began to walk, following a path that was barely visible beneath a thick carpet of silver-grey moss. The air grew colder, and a fog began to roll in, not a natural mist, but a thick, swirling vapor that seemed to glow with a faint, bioluminescent light. As they moved deeper, the forest changed. The trees were no longer organic. Their trunks were reinforced with brass bands, and their leaves were thin sheets of copper that chimed in the wind. "It's a machine," Reed realized, touching a trunk. He felt the vibration of gears deep within the earth. "The entire forest is a localized atmospheric stabilizer. My uncle wasn't just hiding relics, he was protecting the very environment from something." They reached a clearing where a massive glass dome stood, half buried in the earth. This was the Arboretum. Inside, plants from every corner of the globe grew in impossible conditions, their roots entwined with glowing fiber-optic cables. In the center of the dome was a stone altar, and upon it sat the third relic, a golden astrolabe. But beside the altar stood a figure they hadn't expected to see. It was Mr. Miller, the quiet village lawyer Elena had mentioned back at the kitchen table. The man she claimed her uncle truly trusted. He looked different now. The humble suit was gone, replaced by a dark, high-collared coat. He held a small remote detonator in his hand. "Mr. Miller," Elena gasped, stepping forward. You were the one I trusted." "And you were right to, Elena," Miller said, his voice smooth and devoid of its previous stutter. "I served your uncle for 30 years. But Thomas was blinded by his morality. He believed these relics should be hidden to protect the world. I believe they should be used to save it. By giving them to the Syndicate." Reed asked, his hand moving toward the compass in his pocket. "The Syndicate is a tool, Mr. Reed," Miller replied, his eyes cold. "Vane is a fool who thinks in terms of money. I think in terms of eras. With the pearl, the compass, and the astrolabe, we can reset the void, the collapse of the structural integrity of our world's history. But to do that, the old guardians must be erased." He gestured toward the forest. "The tactical teams are already at the perimeter. They aren't here for the relics. They are here to ensure the Arboretum becomes your tomb." Miller pressed a button on the remote. A low rumble shook the ground, and the glass of the dome began to frost over. The oxygen levels in the room started to drop rapidly. "You have 5 minutes before the Arboretum consumes its own atmosphere," Miller said, backing toward a hidden exit. "It's a shame, really. You were an excellent architect, Mr. Reed. You almost understood the design." The hiss of escaping air was a death sentence. Mr. Miller vanished through a sliding panel in the stone altar, leaving Mr. Reed and Elena trapped within the suffocating beauty of the glass dome. The copper leaves of the mechanical trees outside chimed one last time before the frost turned the world white, sealing them in a crystalline cage. "Reed. The air. It's getting heavy," Elena gasped, clutching at her throat. Mr. Reed didn't panic. Panic was for those who didn't understand how systems were built. He ran to the golden astrolabe. Unlike the pearl or the compass, the astrolabe was a complex lattice of interlocking rings. As the oxygen levels plummeted, the plants within the dome began to wilt, their bioluminescence fading from a vibrant green to a sickly, dying purple. "The plants," Reed muttered, his vision beginning to blur at the edges. The fiber optic cables. They aren't just for data. They're artificial veins. He looked at the blueprints again. In the margins of the Arboretum schematic, his uncle had doodled a small, inverted triangle. In architecture, it was often a symbol for a drain or a pressure release. He scanned the floor. He found it, a small, triangular brass plate set into the base of the stone altar. "Elena, help me." Together, they threw their weight against the altar, sliding it a few inches to the left. The brass plate was a manual override. Reed used the tip of the silver compass to jam into the center of the triangle. He twisted it with every ounce of strength he had left. A sharp, metallic clunk echoed through the dome. Instead of more air leaving, a rush of cold, fresh oxygen surged up from the floor. The Arboretum was designed to be a self-contained lung. Miller had reversed the flow, but the manual override had restored the cycle. As the air cleared, the golden astrolabe began to glow. The rings started to spin, faster and faster, until they were nothing but a golden blur. A holographic projection erupted from the center of the relic, filling the dome with a map of the night sky. But it wasn't the sky of 2026. "The stars are wrong," Elena whispered, her breath returning. "They aren't wrong," Reed replied, staring at the projection. "They are historical. This is a map of the sky as it appeared on the night the first relic was hidden, hundreds of years ago." The projection shifted, focusing on a single point in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. A fourth coordinate appeared, glowing in a deep, blood-red hue. "The final seal," Reed said. "The void isn't a metaphor, Elena. It's a place. A physical rupture in the seabed that my uncle was trying to plug with these relics." Suddenly, the glass of the dome shattered. It wasn't the pressure. It was a hail of high-caliber bullets. Vane's tactical team had arrived, and they weren't waiting for the air to run out anymore. Mr. Reed grabbed the glowing astrolabe and Elena's hand. "The mechanical trees." Reed pointed to the gnarled brass oaks outside. "If they're reinforced with metal, they can act as a Faraday cage. We need to get to the perimeter before they use the thermal scanners." They dove through the jagged hole in the glass, the copper leaves screaming as the wind picked up. Behind them, the Arboretum began to self-destruct, the glowing cables short-circuiting in a spectacular display of white sparks. The race for the final relic had just turned into a war. The forest was no longer a sanctuary. It was a symphony of clashing metal. As Mr. Reed and Elena sprinted through the undergrowth, the copper leaves above chimed with a frantic, rhythmic warning. The tactical team behind them moved with mechanical efficiency, their heavy boots thumping against the mossy ground. Every few seconds, a red laser sight cut through the fog, searching for a heart to stop. "Keep low," Reed commanded, pulling Elena behind the massive trunk of a brass-reinforced oak. The tree hummed under his touch. He could feel the internal gears grinding, a vibration that traveled up his arm and settled in his teeth. He realized the forest wasn't just an atmospheric stabilizer. It was a defensive grid. His uncle, the captain, had designed the Blackwood as a living fortress. "The astrolabe," Elena whispered, her eyes fixed on the glowing golden relic in Reed's hands. "It's getting hotter." The rings of the astrolabe were still spinning, emitting a low-frequency pulse that seemed to resonate with the trees. Reed looked at the blueprints one more time, his eyes searching for the Ironwood's protocol. He found it, a small icon of a lightning bolt inscribed within a circle. "The trees are grounded," Reed realized. "But the soil, the moss is infused with silver filaments. It's a giant conductor." He looked at the tactical team closing in. There were 6 of them now, fanning out in a pincer movement. Director Vane stood further back, his grey suit a sharp contrast to the dark metal of the woods. He was holding a handheld scanner, his face illuminated by its blue glow. "Reed." Vane's voice projected through a loudspeaker. "The astrolabe is drawing power from the Arboretum's core. If you don't release it, the feedback loop will incinerate everything within a mile. Don't be a martyr for a dead man's secrets. He's lying, Elena hissed. My uncle wouldn't build a bomb. He didn't build a bomb, Reed said, his gaze shifting to a copper-sheathed root near his feet. He built a lightning rod. Elena, hold onto the brass band on this tree. Do not touch the moss. Whatever you do, do not touch the ground. Reed knelt, balancing the glowing astrolabe on the copper root. He took the silver compass, the second relic, and jammed it into a small slot on the astrolabe's outer ring. The two relics clicked together, forming a unified circuit. The forest suddenly went silent. The wind died down, and the chiming leaves stopped their song. Then, a massive surge of blue electricity erupted from the astrolabe. The current didn't travel through the air. It raced through the silver-infused moss. The tactical men, standing on the conductive ground, were hit instantly. Their electronic headsets sparked, and their equipment short-circuited in a shower of white light. They collapsed, not dead, but paralyzed by the massive electromagnetic pulse. Vane, standing on a stone path, was untouched. He stared in horror as his team fell. The void is hungry, Vane. Reed shouted, grabbing the combined relics and pulling Elena toward the western edge of the woods. And you're the only one left to feed it. They broke into a run, the forest behind them glowing with the fading blue light of the discharge. They reached the perimeter fence, a simple chain-link structure that felt flimsy compared to the mechanical titans they had just left. Reed used the heat from the astrolabe to melt the lock, and they tumbled out onto a dirt road where a rusted, forgotten truck was parked. Where to now? Elena asked, her voice trembling with adrenaline. Reed looked at the red coordinate on the astrolabe's projection. It was no longer a vague point in the ocean. It was a specific name. The Kraken's spine. We're going to the coast, Reed said, hot wiring the truck. We need a boat. A big one. The rusted truck rattled as Mr. Reed pushed it to its limits, the engine screaming a protest against the steep, winding roads that led away from the Blackwood forest. Beside him, Elena sat in a state of shock, her hands hovering near the combined relics. The silver compass and the golden astrolabe were now fused into a single, pulsing device. The red light emanating from the center of the mechanism cast long, rhythmic shadows against the interior of the cabin. The Kraken's spine, Elena whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. My uncle used to mention it in his stories. I thought it was a myth, a series of jagged rocks in the North Atlantic where ships disappeared without a trace. He said the sea there didn't follow the laws of physics. It's not just rocks, Reed replied, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon. According to the structural data embedded in the astrolabe, the Kraken's spine is an artificial reef. A massive, underwater superstructure built to stabilize the tectonic plates. It's the anchor for the void. If that anchor breaks, the continental shelf goes with it. They reached the coast by dawn. The village of St. Jude's was far behind them now. They were at a desolate, industrial shipyard known as the Iron Graveyard. Here, massive tankers and rusted cargo ships were dismantled for scrap. It was a place of ghosts and twisted metal. The perfect spot to find a vessel that no one would miss. Reed parked the truck behind a pile of shipping containers. He grabbed his bag and the combined relics. We need a deep-sea submersible or a reinforced hull. Something that can withstand the pressure of the spine. As they moved through the graveyard, a familiar sound echoed through the foggy air, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of a helicopter. Vane, Reed hissed. He's not giving up. He must have tracked the electromagnetic signature of the astrolabe. They ducked into the shadow of a half-dismantled destroyer. The helicopter circled above, its searchlight cutting through the mist like a hungry eye. Reed scanned the docks. At the very end of the pier sat a small, rugged-looking vessel painted in a faded safety orange. It was the SS Navigator, a retired research submersible tender. There, Reed pointed. If that ship is still functional, it has a crane and a diving bell. It's our only shot. They ran for the pier, their footsteps echoing on the metal gratings. Just as they reached the gangplank of the navigator, the helicopter hovered directly above them. The side door slid open, and a figure descended on a fast rope. It wasn't a tactical soldier. It was Mr. Miller. He landed on the pier with surprising grace, his dark coat fluttering in the rotor wash. He was holding a sleek, silver device, a high-frequency disruptor. "You've done well to get this far, Mr. Reed," Miller shouted over the noise. "But you're playing with forces you don't understand. The void isn't just a geological threat, it's a doorway. The Syndicate doesn't want to plug it. They want to open it." "Open it?" Elena cried out. "To what?" "To the source," Miller replied, his eyes gleaming with a terrifying zeal. "The relics aren't plugs, they are the coordinates for the return. Now, give me the device, or I will let the void take this entire coastline before the hour is out." Reed looked at the navigator, then at Miller, and finally at the pulsing red light of the astrolabe. He realized that the mystery hadn't just been about a house or a pearl. It was a race for the very fabric of reality. "The navigator is a deep-sea ship, Miller," Reed said, stepping onto the gangplank. "If you want the relics, you'll have to come and get them at the bottom of the ocean." With a sudden burst of movement, Reed and Elena scrambled onto the deck and slammed the heavy iron hatch shut. The engines of the navigator groaned to life, the old ship shivering as it prepared to head into the heart of the storm. The SS Navigator groaned as it crested the massive, slate-gray waves of the North Atlantic. The iron graveyard was a receding memory, swallowed by a thick wall of fog and the relentless pursuit of the Syndicate's helicopter. Inside the bridge, the air smelled of salt, diesel, and ancient electronics. Mr. Reed gripped the brass steering wheel, his eyes alternating between the erratic sonar display and the glowing red light of the combined relics. "The helicopter pulled back," Elena reported, her face pressed against the thick, salt-crusted porthole. "But I can see a larger shadow on the horizon. It looks like a military-grade frigate. They're not chasing us anymore, they're herding us." "Let them herd," Reed muttered, his jaw set. "The deeper the water, the less their numbers matter." According to the astrolabe, the Kraken's spine lay directly beneath them. The ocean floor here dropped away into a trench that was off the official charts. Reed engaged the diving bell's winch system. The heavy, spherical chamber lowered into the churning water. "We have to go down," Reed said, handing Elena a pressurized suit. "The navigator won't survive the surface for long once that frigate arrives. We need to reach the stabilization reef before Miller can use his disruptor from above." They climbed into the diving bell, the space cramped and humid. Reed sealed the inner hatch, and the world became a series of rhythmic clangs as the cable unspooled. As they descended, the blue light of the surface faded into a murky green, and then, finally, into the absolute, crushing blackness of the midnight zone. The bell's exterior floodlights flickered to life. The scene outside was breathtaking and terrifying. It wasn't just a coral reef or a rock formation. The Kraken's spine was a sprawling, underwater metropolis of gears, obsidian pillars, and glowing thermal vents. It looked like a clockwork heart built by a giant. "It's beautiful," Elena whispered, her voice echoing in the small chamber. "It's a machine," Reed corrected, his architect's eye scanning the massive structures. "Look at the central pillar. It's a tension rod. It's holding the tectonic plates together by pure mechanical force. But it's cracked." A massive fissure, glowing with a malevolent violet light, ran down the center of the obsidian rod. The void was leaking, a gravitational anomaly that made the water around the bell shimmer like a desert mirage. Suddenly, a massive shockwave hit the diving bell. The cable snapped. "Reed!" Elena screamed as the bell tumbled into the darkness. They weren't falling, they were being pulled. The gravitational leak in the spine was drawing them directly toward the violet fissure. Reed fought to reach the controls, his body feeling 5 times its normal weight. He grabbed the combined relics, the pearl, the compass, and the astrolabe, and jammed them into a specialized slot near the bell's viewport. "The final seal," Reed gasped, his lungs straining against the pressure. "It's not a key for a door. It's a battery for the reef." As the diving bell slammed into the side of the obsidian pillar, the violet light surged, and the relics began to scream with a high-pitched, harmonic frequency. The mystery of the Black Villa was no longer a ghost story. It was the final repair job for the world itself. The diving bell shuddered as it wedged itself into the jagged crack of the obsidian pillar. Outside, the violet light of the void pulsed like a dying star, distorting the very water into strange, geometric shapes. Mr. Reed felt a crushing weight against his chest, a combination of the ocean's depth and the gravitational pull of the rupture. "The relics," Elena gasped, her hand outstretched toward the glowing slot. "They're glowing white now. They're changing." She was right. The pearl, the compass, and the astrolabe had lost their individual colors. Fused together, they were emitting a pure, blinding light that began to counter the violet shadows of the fissure. The high-pitched scream of the device shifted into a deep, resonant hum, the sound of a massive engine finding its rhythm after a century of silence. "The blueprints, they were never about the villa," Reed said, realization dawning on him as he watched the white light bridge the gap in the stone. "The villa was just the antenna. This reef is the transmitter. My uncle wasn't just a captain or an architect, he was the chief engineer of the planet's stability." Suddenly, a series of bright, artificial lights cut through the darkness from above. 3 sleek, black tactical submersibles, syndicate vessels, descended toward them. They didn't look like research craft. They were armed with high-pressure thermal lances. "Vane's people," Reed hissed. "They don't want to fix the reef. They want to harvest the energy from the void." The lead submersible fired a lance. The superheated beam sliced through the water, striking the obsidian pillar just inches from the diving bell. The entire structure groaned, and the violet light flared up in response to the damage. The stabilization was failing. "If they break the pillar, the void will expand," Elena cried. "It will swallow the Atlantic." Reed looked at the combined relics. There was one final piece of the puzzle. A small, recessed button at the base of the astrolabe that he had ignored until now. It was marked with the captain's signature anchor symbol. "Elena, I need you to hold the manual stabilizer," Reed commanded, pointing to a heavy iron lever on the side of the bell. "I have to manually sync the relics with the reef's internal clockwork. If I miss the frequency, we'll be crushed instantly." He closed his eyes, tuning out the sound of the approaching submersibles and the groaning of the metal. He listened to the hum of the relics. It was a heartbeat. He pressed the button in sync with the pulse. A massive shockwave of white energy erupted from the diving bell. It didn't destroy, it repaired. The obsidian crack began to fuse together, the violet light turning into a calm, steady blue. The gravitational pull vanished, replaced by a sudden, buoyant lift. The syndicate submersibles were caught in the wake of the energy surge. Their electronic systems, designed for destruction, couldn't handle the harmonic frequency. They spun out of control, their hulls groaning as they were pushed back toward the surface by a sudden, upward current of warm water. "It's working," Reed whispered, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "The reef is holding." But as the blue light stabilized, a voice crackled through the bell's short-range radio. It wasn't Vane, and it wasn't Miller. "A noble effort, Mr. Reed," the voice said, calm, cold, and echoing with authority. "But you've only delayed the inevitable. The void is not a leak, it's a mouth. And now, you've shown me exactly where to find the heart." Reed looked at the sonar. A fourth vessel, much larger than the others and shaped like a giant, silver needle, was descending from the darkness of the trench. The true boss had finally arrived. The silver needle-shaped vessel, a masterpiece of forbidden engineering, glided through the crushing depths with a terrifying elegance. It didn't have propellers or visible thrusters. It seemed to slide through the water as if the ocean itself was parting to make way for it. This was the Akron, the flagship of the syndicate's silent partner. The pressure at this depth should have crumpled that hull like a soda can. Reed whispered, his eyes glued to the sonar. Unless it's made of the same obsidian alloy as the reef. Reed, it's docking. Elena said, her voice trembling. A mechanical arm, sleek and chrome, extended from the Atron's nose. It didn't grab the diving bell, it bypassed them entirely, plunging into the base of the obsidian pillar. A low-frequency thrum vibrated through the water, making the diving bell's rivets scream. The radio crackled again. You were right about the frequency, architect. But you missed the scale. The relics are not just a battery. They are the index. Without them, the reef is a blind giant. With them, it is a weapon of tectonic restructuring. The video monitor on the console flickered to life. A man sat in a high-back chair, his face obscured by the high-contrast lighting of a luxury cabin. He was sipping a glass of water, his hands steady and old. Dr. Thorne? Reed asked, his memory flashing back to a dusty portrait he had seen in the Black Villa's attic. A man standing next to Captain Thomas, both holding a set of compasses. Dr. Thorne is a name I haven't used in a very long time. The man replied, Your uncle called me a madman when I proposed the Great Realignment. He wanted to preserve the world as it was, stagnant, crumbling, and unpredictable. I want to shape it. I want to decide which continents stay above the waves and which ones return to the void. Thorne's vessel began to pulse with a dark, red light. It was a counter-frequency. The blue light of the stabilized reef began to flicker. He's trying to override the relics. Reed shouted. He scrambled to the control panel. Elena, the manual stabilizer isn't enough anymore. We have to eject the bell and wedge it deeper into the core. If we can get close enough to the main gear set, we can jam the realignment. If we eject, we have no way back to the surface. Elena reminded him. If we don't, there won't be a surface to go back to. Reed replied. He grabbed the lever for the emergency explosive bolts. The diving bell sat on a hair trigger. Above them, the Akron began to drill deeper, its silver hull reflecting the dying blue light. The battle for the world's foundation had reached its most desperate hour. The explosive bolts firing was a sharp, metallic, that echoed through the small cabin of the diving bell. For a terrifying heartbeat, there was no sound at all, only the sensation of weightlessness as the bell detached from the SS Navigator's broken cable and plummeted toward the glowing violet maw of the obsidian pillar. Hold on! Reed yelled, his hands flying across the auxiliary thruster controls. The bell wasn't designed for maneuverability, but it had enough compressed air to nudge its trajectory. They weren't just falling into a hole, they were entering the throat of a planetary machine. As they passed the threshold of the outer shell, the crushing pressure of the deep ocean suddenly vanished. They had entered a pressurized pocket of air, or something like it, maintained by the ancient technology of the reef. Reed, look at the scale of it. Elena whispered, her voice trembling. The interior of the Kraken's spine was a cathedral of movement. Massive brass gears, some the size of city blocks, turned with a slow, relentless grace. Obsidian shafts, pulsing with the blue energy of the relics, acted as the nervous system, carrying power to the tectonic plates. This was the grand escapement, the regulator that kept the Earth's crust from sliding into chaos. But the Akron was already there. The silver needle-shaped vessel had bypassed the external structure and was now hovering near the central axis, the main spindle of the world. Thorne is targeting the balance spring, Reed said, his architect's mind overlaying the blueprints onto the massive machinery before them. If he snaps that spring, the tension will release all at once. The Great Realignment won't just be a shift, it will be a global earthquake. The silver sub began to fire its thermal lances again, but this time, it wasn't aiming at Reed. It was cutting through the support struts of the central axis. Sparks the size of lightning bolts showered the interior of the chamber, illuminating the ancient carvings on the gears, the same sea monsters and stars Reed had seen in the Black Villa. "We can't shoot him," Reed muttered, looking at their lack of weapons. "But we can jam the gears." He steered the diving bell toward a narrowing gap between two of the largest gears. If he could wedge the bell, reinforced and heavy, into the teeth of the mechanism, it would create a temporary deadlock. It would stop Thorn's progress, but it would also mean the bell would be crushed as the machine tried to turn. "Elena, the relics," Reed said, his voice dropping to a calm, steady tone. "I need you to reverse the polarity on the astrolabe. Use the compass to find the resonance of the gear teeth. We don't just want to jam it, we want to fuse the metal. Reed, if we do this, we're stuck here," she said, looking him in the eye. "We were never supposed to leave the Black Villa." "Elena," he replied with a faint, wry smile. "But if we're going to go out, let's make sure the world keeps spinning." He slammed the thrusters to full power. The diving bell surged forward, a tiny orange dot heading straight for the heart of the golden machine. The diving bell was a speck of dust in the eye of a god. As it surged toward the junction of the two primary gears, each a mile wide and glowing with the friction of centuries, the air inside the cabin became superheated. Mr. Reed gripped the thruster joysticks, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on the gap. The Akron was closing in from the flank, its silver hull gleaming like a shark in a dark pool. "Now, Elena, the compass," Reed roared. Elena shoved the silver compass into the heart of the astrolabe. The combined device didn't just glow, it screamed. A beam of concentrated white light shot forward, striking the teeth of the brass gears. Where the light touched, the metal didn't melt, it expanded. The ancient alloys, designed to withstand the pressure of the Atlantic, began to warp and swell under the relic's harmonic influence. The diving bell slammed into the widening gap. The impact was violent, throwing Reed against the control panel and shattering the secondary viewport. A blast of freezing sea mist hissed through the crack, but the bell held. It was wedged tight, a sacrificial wedge of orange steel jammed into the mouth of the world's clock. Metal screamed against metal. The sound was a low, subterranean groan that vibrated through Reed's very marrow. The great escapement shuddered. The relentless rotation of the gears slowed, the brass teeth grinding into the reinforced hull of the diving bell. "You are an ant trying to stop a tidal wave, Reed." Thorn's voice crackled over the radio, distorted by the massive electromagnetic interference. "The tension in the balance spring is already at its peak. If you stall the gears, the energy has nowhere to go. You'll blow the entire reef apart." "He's right, Reed," Elena cried, looking at the pressure gauges. The needles were spinning into the red. "The energy is backing up. The whole chamber is becoming a pressure cooker. We're not just stalling it," Reed said, his voice dropping to a whisper of intense focus. He reached for the pearl, the white pearl of the sea, which sat at the apex of the fused device. It was the only organic element in a world of cold stone and hard metal. "The pearl isn't a battery, Elena. It's a dampener. It's the white in the void. It absorbs the chaos." He pulled the pearl from its setting and pressed it against the cold, vibrating wall of the diving bell. The effect was instantaneous. The violent shaking stopped. The red-hot friction of the gears cooled into a soft, bioluminescent blue. The pearl began to drink the excess energy, glowing with a brilliance that made the interior of the bell look like the center of a sun. The gears didn't just stop, they locked. A perfect, silent deadlock. Outside, the Akron veered away, its thermal lances useless against the stabilized field. Thorn had lost his leverage. The great realignment was stalled. But the silence was short-lived. A new sound began to rise from the depths of the central axis, a deep, rhythmic thudding. It wasn't the machinery. It was something else. Something that had been sleeping behind the void, waiting for the clock to stop. "Read," Elena whispered, pointing at the viewport. "The gears, they're not moving, but the shadows are." Behind the massive clockwork, the violet light was returning. But it wasn't a leak anymore. It was a shape. The shadow did not emerge so much as it solidified from the violet haze. It was a flickering silhouette, taller than a man, composed of shimmering water and refracted light. It stood upon the frozen teeth of the great escapement, unaffected by the crushing depth or the lack of oxygen. "Is that my uncle?" Elena whispered, her face pressed against the cracked glass. "No," Reed replied, his eyes scanning the figure structure. "It's a projection, a memory stored in the very atoms of the reef." The figure raised a hand, and the violet light softened into a warm amber. A voice, resonant and multi-layered, filled the diving bell, bypassing the radio and speaking directly into their minds. It was the voice of 1,000 navigators, a chorus of those who had guarded the spine before the Black Villa was even a blueprint. "The gears are still, but the heart is heavy." The echo spoke. "You have used the pearl to silence the storm, but the pearl is a vessel, not a seal. It cannot hold the weight of the void forever. If the cycle is not restarted, the pressure will turn this sanctuary into a tomb." Suddenly, the Akron moved. Thorn, sensing the shift in energy, realized the deadlock was his final opportunity to strike. The silver needle vessel surged forward, its thermal lances glowing with a blinding intensity. It didn't aim for the diving bell this time. It aimed for the echo. "He's trying to destroy the interface," Reed shouted. He scrambled to the controls, but the diving bell was hopelessly wedged. Its thrusters hissed and sputtered, unable to move the weight of the massive gears. The first thermal beam sliced through the water, passing through the echo as if it was smoke. The figure didn't flinch, but the amber light flickered dangerously. "The one who seeks to reshape the world is a thief of time." The echo continued, its voice unhurried. "He does not understand that to rule the void is to be consumed by it. Architect, you have the blueprints. You know the secret of the final pillar." Reed's mind raced. He pulled the manila folder from his bag, the papers now damp and translucent. He looked at the drawing of the Kraken's spine. In the very center, hidden behind the grand escapement, was a small, circular room marked the compass rose, the center of the axis. Reed muttered, "We're not in the core yet. We're only in the engine room. The actual control center is inside the central spindle." "How do we get there?" Elena asked, glancing at the Akron as it prepared for another strike. "We have to go out," Reed said. "Out? Into the water. We'll be crushed." "Not into the water." Reed pointed to a small, circular hatch at the very base of the diving bell, a docking port intended for specialized maintenance. "The echo is holding a pocket of air around the gears. If we move fast, we can scramble through the gear teeth and enter the spindle directly. It's our only chance to restart the clock before Thorn breaks the world." Reed grabbed the combined relics and a handheld torch. He looked at Elena, seeing the fear in her eyes, but also the same steel that must have been in her uncle's heart. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded, her hand finding his. "Let's fix the clock, Mr. Reed." The transition from the pressurized safety of the diving bell to the open cavern of the grand escapement was like stepping onto the surface of another planet. Mr. Reed emerged first, his boots clanging against the massive brass tooth of the primary gear. He reached back for Elena, pulling her into the shimmering amber pocket of air maintained by the echo. The air was thick, tasting of ozone and ancient copper, but it was breathable. "Don't look down," Reed cautioned, his voice sounding strangely resonant in the atmospheric bubble. Below them lay miles of vertical space, a dizzying drop into the violet heart of the trench. They were standing on a frozen landscape of machinery. Above, the Akron was a silver predatory shape, its thermal lances glowing as Thorn desperately searched for a way to break the deadlock without destroying the very prize he sought to steal. They began the trek across the gear teeth. Each step was a climb over a brass ridge the size of a small house. The metal was warm to the touch, vibrating with the trapped kinetic energy of the stalled world. Reed kept his eyes on the central spindle, a towering obsidian cylinder that served as the axis for the entire reef. The entrance should be at the base of the third tier. Reed shouted over the low-frequency hum of the relics. Suddenly, a massive echoed through the chamber. The Akron had fired a physical harpoon, a titanium bolt that slammed into the gear they were standing on. The entire mechanism groaned, shifting a few inches. The sudden movement nearly threw Elena into the abyss, but Reed caught her, his fingers digging into a seam in the brass. "He's trying to shake us off," Elena cried, pointing at the silver sub. "Ignore him. The spindle is right there." They reached a circular hatch at the base of the obsidian tower. It was marked with a gold leaf compass rose. Unlike the heavy iron doors of the villa, this hatch was made of a translucent, glass-like material. As Reed approached, the combined relics in his hand pulsed in a rapid, welcoming sequence. The glass dissolved into a fine mist, allowing them to step inside before re-solidifying behind them. The silence was immediate. The interior of the spindle was a vertical shaft filled with thousands of floating, glowing crystals. A spiral staircase made of dark, polished wood wound its way up the center, seemingly held in place by magnetism rather than mortar. This was the compass rose, the brain of the Kraken's spine. At the very top of the staircase sat a circular console. It wasn't made of gears or wires. It was a pool of liquid silver, reflecting the stars that the astrolabe had projected in the arboretum. "This is it," Reed whispered, his breath hitching. "The navigation room. This is where the captain determined the frequency of the Earth's crust." He approached the silver pool. As he stood over it, the liquid began to swirl, forming a 3D map of the North Atlantic. He saw the void represented as a dark, swirling vortex, and the Kraken's spine as a glowing needle attempting to stitch the tear shut. But there was a problem. The map showed 3 red dots approaching the spindle from the outside. Not the submersibles, but something else. "Thorn isn't just using thermal lances anymore," Elena said, looking at a secondary display. "He's released the suture breakers, autonomous drones designed to dismantle underwater structures. He's going to strip the spindle from the outside in." Reed looked at the liquid silver. He knew he didn't just have to restart the clock. He had to weaponize the reef's own defensive frequency to push Thorn back. He took the fused device, the pearl, compass, and astrolabe, and prepared to submerge it into the silver pool. "If I do this, I become the navigator," Reed said, looking at Elena. "I don't know if I can come back from the interface." Mr. Reed looked into the swirling pool of liquid silver. It was more than just a pool of metal. It was a fluid computer, a reservoir of ancestral knowledge and planetary data. The red dots on the perimeter were moving closer. Thorn's drones were beginning their work, their high-frequency cutters vibrating against the external hull of the spindle. The entire room shook, and several of the floating crystals fell, shattering like glass on the dark floor. "If you do this," Elena whispered, her voice trembling as she looked at the silver pool, "what happens to you?" "My uncle never spoke of anyone returning from the Rose." "I don't think I have a choice, Elena," Reed said. The blueprints showed a pilot's seat. "I thought it was metaphorical. I see now that it's biological. The machine needs a human pulse to synchronize the frequency. It needs an architect to understand the structure." He took a deep breath and plunged the fused relics, the white pearl, the compass, and the astrolabe, into the center of the silver pool. The reaction was instantaneous. The liquid silver didn't just absorb the relics. It surged upward like a living tide, wrapping around Reed's arms and chest. It wasn't cold, as he had expected. It was burning with a strange, information-rich heat. He felt a sharp, electric sting at the base of his skull, and then the world of stone and glass vanished. Reed's consciousness expanded. He was no longer a man in a pressurized room. He was the Kraken's spine itself. He felt the cold pressure of the Atlantic against his outer obsidian skin. He felt the slow, rhythmic grinding of the tectonic plates beneath him, like two massive continental beasts trying to slide past each other. And he felt the parasites, the suture breakers, gnawing at his side. "I see them." Reed's voice spoke, but it didn't come from his throat. It echoed through the crystals in the room, sounding like the wind through a canyon. He saw the Akron hovering near the grand escapement. To his new, expanded senses, Thorn's vessel looked like a splinter in a finger, a foreign object causing inflammation in the planetary system. Reed reached out with his mind, grasping the strings of the gravitational field that the reef controlled. "Reed, can you hear me?" Elena's voice was a tiny, distant spark in the vast ocean of data. "I hear you," he replied. "But the world is so loud. Every wave, every tremor, it's all connected." On the external hull, a suture breaker drone fired its lance, cutting deep into a secondary support strut. Reed winced, a phantom pain lancing through his shoulder. He focused his intent on the drone. He didn't use a laser or a missile. He simply adjusted the local gravity around the drone. The water around the small machine became 100 times heavier. The drone, designed for high pressure but not for a localized gravitational collapse, was crushed into a tiny, silent ball of scrap in less than a second. Thorn, watching from the Akron, realized the game had changed. The architect wasn't just hiding in the spindle. He had become the spindle. Maximum output. Thorn's voice screamed over the comms, audible to Reed's internal ears. "If we can't control the reef, we'll shatter it. Burn the core." The Akron turned its massive, primary thermal cannon toward the central spindle. A beam of white-hot plasma began to charge at its tip. Reed felt the buildup of energy, a searing heat directed at his very heart. He knew he had to restart the gears now, or the energy of the void would have no channel to flow into, and the resulting explosion would tear the seabed apart. The silver tide had completely encased Mr. Reed now, forming a shimmering, metallic chrysalis that glowed with the intensity of a dying star. Inside the compass rose, the floating crystals spun in a frantic, blinding circle, reflecting the data stream of the planet itself. Elena stood back, her hands over her eyes, as the temperature in the room plummeted. The machine was drawing every ounce of heat to fuel the restart. Reed's mind was no longer focused on his own survival. He was tracing the ley lines of the Earth's crust. He felt the massive tension in the grand escapement below, the gears he had jammed with the diving bell. To save the world, he had to destroy the very thing he had used as a shield. "Elena." Reed's voice was a booming vibration that shook the obsidian walls. "I have to release the deadlock. When the gears move, the diving bell will be crushed. You have to get to the escape pod in the upper tier. Now." "I'm not leaving you, Reed," she screamed against the roaring wind of the silver pool. "The navigator stays with the ship." Reed countered. "The pod is keyed to your DNA. It's the only way out. My uncle designed it for you. Go." In the silence of his mind, Reed reached out to the diving bell. He felt the orange steel groaning under the weight of the brass teeth. With a mental shove that felt like pushing a mountain, he adjusted the torque of the primary drive shaft. The sound was apocalyptic. The diving bell shattered like an eggshell, its metal screaming as it was ground into dust between the gears. But the deadlock was broken. The grand escapement began to turn once more, slowly at first, then with a relentless, surging power. Outside, The Akron fired its plasma cannon. The beam of white-hot energy struck the spindle with the force of a nuclear detonation. Reed felt the impact as a searing pain across his chest. The silver pool rippled, turning a violent, angry red. Thorn was pouring everything he had into the destruction of the core. "You think you can hold the world together?" Thorn's voice mocked from the void. "The void is entropy, Reed. It is the natural state of the universe. You are just a man with a set of rusty keys." "I am an architect," Reed whispered through the silver mask. "And I know how to ground a circuit." Reed didn't fight the plasma beam. He absorbed it. He redirected the energy of Thorn's attack into the central spindle, using the Syndicate's own weapon to jumpstart the final seal. The violet light of the void, which had been leaking into the cavern, was suddenly sucked back into the center of the spindle. The reef acted as a giant lightning rod, channeling the chaos of the void and the heat of the plasma beam down into the molten core of the planet, where it could be recycled into harmless geothermal energy. The Akron was caught in the gravitational backwash. The very power it had fired was now pulling it toward the crushing teeth of the gears. "No! Reverse thrusters!" Thorn's voice was filled with a sudden, sharp terror. But it was too late. The silver needle vessel was dragged into the grand escapement. Thorn's masterpiece of forbidden engineering met the ancient, unstoppable force of the captain's clock. There was no explosion, just the cold, mechanical sound of a machine being dismantled by a larger, more powerful machine. The Syndicate's threat was erased in a single, grinding rotation. Inside the spindle, the silver pool began to drain. Reed felt his connection to the reef fading. His heart began to beat on its own again. He collapsed onto the floor, the silver receding from his skin, leaving him cold, exhausted, and utterly alone in the dark. "Reed!" A soft voice called out from the shadows of the upper tier. He looked up. Elena hadn't taken the pod. She was standing by the silver pool, holding the white pearl, which had returned to its original, milky glow. The clock was ticking perfectly. The world was steady. But as they looked at the monitors, they saw a final message flickering in the dark. Protocol 50. The final voyage initiated. The compass rose was deathly silent, save for the rhythmic, metallic heartbeat of the world. The liquid silver had retreated into the floor, leaving the room illuminated only by the faint, pulsing blue of the obsidian walls. Mr. Reed lay on the dark wood, his lungs burning with every breath. He felt strangely hollow, as if the vast, planetary consciousness he had just touched had left a vacuum in its wake. Elena knelt beside him, pressing the white pearl into his hand. It was cool and steady. "The message, Reed," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the console. "Protocol 50. What does it mean?" Reed pulled himself up, using the pedestal for support. His architect's mind, still buzzing with the residue of the silver interface, scanned the final sequence of the blueprints. "Protocol 50 isn't a self-destruct," he said, his voice raspy. "It's a reset. The Kraken's spine has been stabilized, but its location is now known. My uncle, he knew that eventually, the world would find the heart. So he built a way to hide it again." The spindle began to tilt. It wasn't the violent lurch of a collapse. It was the graceful, controlled movement of a ship leaving port. Outside the viewport, the massive brass gears of the grand escapement began to fold inward, like the petals of a metallic lotus. The obsidian pillars retracted, and the entire structure, miles of ancient engineering, began to sink deeper into the trench. "We're moving," Elena said, clutching the railing. "Where is it taking us?" "To the void's cradle," Reed replied. "The deepest part of the Atlantic, where the pressure is too great for any Syndicate submersible to follow. The reef is going into hibernation for another 100 years." "But the escape pod," Elena pointed to the upper tier. "If the reef sinks that deep, The pod will never make it to the surface. We'll be buried with the machine. Reed looked at the console. The silver pool was gone, replaced by a simple, brass-inscribed plate. It featured a single, final instruction. The navigator must leave the rose to find the dawn. It's not a pod for the surface. Reed realized, looking at the architectural symbols. It's a pressurized bridge. It doesn't go up. It goes sideways. He led Elena to the upper chamber. Instead of a traditional escape vessel, they found a small, glass-domed craft docked to the side of the spindle. It was the Morning Star, the captain's private yacht, or at least, a submersible version of it. It was built of the same translucent alloy as the hatch, reinforced to withstand the impossible. They scrambled inside. As Reed sealed the hatch, the Morning Star detached. Through the dome, they watched as the Kraken's spine, the Grand Escapement, and the compass rose vanished into the violet darkness of the abyss. The void was finally sealed. The rupture mended by the very energy Thorn had tried to use to break it. The Morning Star didn't fight the ocean. It caught a deep-sea thermal current, a river in the sea that the captain had mapped decades ago. For hours, they glided through the darkness, passing bioluminescent creatures that had never seen a human light. Eventually, the water began to turn from black to midnight blue, and then to a brilliant, sparkling turquoise. The submersible broke the surface with a gentle splash. They were miles away from the iron graveyard, miles away from the ruins of the Black Villa. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the Atlantic in shades of gold and pink. The air that rushed into the cabin when Reed cracked the hatch was the sweetest thing he had ever tasted. Epilogue. A month later, a new lighthouse stood on the cliff where the Black Villa once cast its shadow. It wasn't a dark, imposing fortress. It was a slender tower of white stone and glass, designed to catch every ray of the sun. Mr. Reed stood at the top, adjusting the lens. He wasn't wearing a suit anymore, but a rugged wool sweater. Beside him, Elena looked out at the sea. She still wore the white pearl on a silver chain around her neck, a reminder of the secret they carried. The syndicate was gone, or at least, the branch that Thorn had led. The Akron was a memory, and the void was a myth once more. Do you think they'll ever find it? Elena asked, watching a distant ship on the horizon. Reed looked down at the blueprints, now framed and hanging on the lighthouse wall. The world has a way of forgetting the things it isn't ready to understand. He said, but the clock is ticking, Elena, and as long as it's ticking, the foundation is safe. He reached out and turned the lighthouse lamp on. Its beam cut through the twilight, a steady, guiding light for anyone lost at sea. The mystery was over, but the watch had just begun.